Welcome, dear listener, to tonight's soothing journey through the annals of ancient history. As you settle in for a restful slumber or a moment of tranquil repose, I invite you to embark with me on a voyage to a distant time and place. A world both fascinating and forbidding, resplendent, yet unforgiving. Before we begin our tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and share. I always enjoy getting to know how far our shared love of warm and rich history. And if you find yourself enchanted by these gentle historical meanderings, I warmly encourage you to subscribe so that we may meet again on many a future evening's storytelling adventure. Now, let us cast our minds back across the millennia to an age when civilization was still in its infancy and life was often nasty, brutish, and short. The ancient Greeks, for all their lofty philosophy and artistic brilliance, inhabited a world fraught with perils and hardships. From the rocky, sun-baked slopes of Attica to the misty shores of Ionia, theirs was a landscape both beautiful and inhospitable. The seas teemed with pirates and monsters, the forests concealed bandits and beasts, and the very earth seemed to heave and tremble with seismic fury. Against this backdrop of natural dangers, the Greeks eked out a precarious existence, their lives governed by the relentless rhythms of the seasons and the whims of capricious gods. For the common man and woman, each day was a struggle for survival, a ceaseless round of toil from dawn to dusk. With scant margin for error, a single failed harvest or untimely illness could spell disaster, plunging entire families into destitution and despair. Yet despite the odds stacked against them, the Greeks persevered and even flourished, building great cities and forging powerful alliances. From the mighty walls of Mycenae to the gleaming temples of Athens, they left an indelible mark on the pages of history. But the road to greatness was paved with blood, sweat, and tears, as rival city-states vied for supremacy on the battlefield and in the political arena. The most feared and formidable of these was undoubtedly Sparta, a society singularly dedicated to the arts of war. For the Spartans, martial prowess was the highest virtue, and all else was subordinate to this ideal. From the moment of birth, Spartan males were earmarked for a life of military service, their bodies and minds honed to a sharp edge through years of ruthless training and indoctrination. The legendary Spartan agoge, or upbringing, was a grueling ordeal that would make even the toughest modern boot camp seem like a summer holiday. Beginning at the tender age of 7, Spartan boys were torn from their families and thrust into a world of unrelenting discipline and hardship. Housed in communal barracks, they were subjected to a regimen of physical conditioning, weapons training, and endurance tests that pushed them to the very limits of human endurance. Hunger was their constant companion, as the boys were kept on a starvation diet to promote toughness and resourcefulness. They were encouraged to steal food to supplement their meager rations, but woe betide the lad who got caught in the act. He would be severely beaten as punishment for his lack of cunning. This brutally effective system produced some of the finest soldiers the world has ever seen. Men who would willingly lay down their lives for Sparta without a second thought. But the Spartan way of life exacted a heavy toll, not only on its own citizens, but on those it subjugated. The Helots, a population of serfs who toiled on the estates of the Spartan elite, lived in a state of perpetual terror, knowing that they could be slaughtered on a whim if their masters deemed them too numerous or troublesome. Periodically, the Spartans would declare war on the Helots, giving their young warriors free rein to murder them with impunity as a rite of passage. This climate of institutionalized brutality bred a society riven by fear and suspicion, where even the bonds of family were subordinate to the demands of the state. Spartan mothers were renowned for their stoicism in the face of adversity, famously admonishing their sons to return from battle with your shield or on it. But beneath this facade of stony resolve, one can only imagine the silent anguish of countless parents forced to surrender their children to the cruel machinery of war. Yet for all its martial prowess, Sparta was ultimately undone by its own inflexibility and insularity. As the world around it changed and evolved, Sparta remained stubbornly mired in its ancient ways, refusing to adapt to new political and economic realities. Its once vaunted army, though still formidable, was gradually eclipsed by the rise of new military powers like Thebes and Macedon. Meanwhile, Athens, Sparta's great rival, was charting a different course. Though no stranger to warfare and brutality, the Athenians prided themselves on their cultural sophistication and democratic ideals. In the golden age of Pericles, Athens blossomed into a center of art, philosophy, and learning, attracting the brightest minds from across the Greek world. But even as it basked in the glow of its own achievements, Athens was beset by internal strife and external threats. The Peloponnesian War, a titanic struggle for supremacy with Sparta, would ultimately drain the city's coffers and sap its martial strength. And the democratic system, for all its lofty principles, was not immune to the machinations of demagogues and opportunists. One such figure was Alcibiades, a brilliant but erratic statesman and general who would come to embody both the best and worst of Athenian democracy. Born into a wealthy and influential family, Alcibiades was blessed with charm, charisma, and a keen strategic mind. He quickly rose through the ranks of Athenian politics, earning a reputation as a daring military commander and a silver-tongued orator. But Alcibiades was also a man of prodigious appetites and vaulting ambition, prone to reckless gambles and abrupt changes of allegiance. In 415 BCE, he convinced the Athenian assembly to launch a massive expedition against the city of Syracuse, a key ally of Sparta. The campaign was a disaster from the start, plagued by poor planning, divided leadership, and bad luck. As the Athenian fleet languished in the harbour of Syracuse, ravaged by disease and hemmed in by a superior Syracusan navy, Alcibiades was recalled to Athens to face charges of impiety and sacrilege. Rather than risk a trial and possible execution, he defected to Sparta, offering his services to the enemy and sharing vital intelligence on Athenian military plans. The defection of Alcibiades was a bitter blow to Athenian morale and a turning point in the war. With their best general now fighting for the other side, the Athenians were forced to rely on lesser talents to prosecute the conflict. The result was a string of costly defeats and setbacks that ultimately led to the city's surrender and subjugation by Sparta in 404 BCE. The human cost of this protracted conflict was staggering, with tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians killed or enslaved on both sides. The once mighty Athenian navy, the pride and joy of the city, was reduced to a shadow of its former self, its ships rotting at anchor, and its sailors pressed into service as infantrymen. For the average Athenian, life during wartime was a grim struggle for survival. With the city's agricultural lands ravaged by Spartan armies, food was scarce and expensive. Many citizens were reduced to eating grass and roots to stave off starvation, while others resorted to cannibalism in their desperation. Disease was also rampant, as overcrowding and poor sanitation turned Athens into a breeding ground for plague and pestilence. The historian Thucydides, who himself fell ill during the Great Plague of 430 BCE, describes the horrors of the epidemic in harrowing detail. The bodies of dying men lay one upon another, and half-dead creatures reeled about the streets and gathered round all the fountains in their longing for water. The sacred places also in which they had quartered themselves were full of corpses of persons that had died there, just as they were. For as the disaster passed all bounds, men, not knowing what was to become of them, became utterly careless of everything, whether sacred or profane. Against this backdrop of suffering and despair, the fate of Athens' vast slave population was particularly grim. Comprising perhaps a third of the city's total inhabitants, slaves were vital to the functioning of the Athenian economy, toiling in the fields, workshops and mines that generated much of the city's wealth. But in times of war and upheaval, slaves were often the first to suffer. With food supplies running low and masters unable to provide for them, many slaves were simply abandoned to fend for themselves. Others were worked to death in the brutal silver mines of Laurium, where conditions were so appalling that even free men were known to beg for the release of death. One can only imagine the terror and desperation of a slave trapped in this hellish underworld, toiling in darkness and squalor for the enrichment of his Athenian overlords. The air thick with dust and noxious fumes, the tunnels echoing with the cries of the dying and the clanking of iron chains. Yet even in this abyss of human misery, there were glimmers of hope and resilience. The story of Zeno of Citium, the founder of the Stoic school of philosophy, is a testament to the indomitable human spirit in the face of adversity. Born in the city of Citium on the island of Cyprus, Zeno began his life as a merchant, plying his trade across the Mediterranean. But a shipwreck off the coast of Greece left him penniless and alone, forcing him to start anew in Athens as a lowly servant. Despite his humble circumstances, Zeno was a man of prodigious intellect and curiosity. He fell in with a group of philosophers who introduced him to the works of Socrates, Plato, and other great thinkers of the age. Inspired by their ideas, he began to formulate his own philosophy, which emphasized the virtues of reason, self-control, and inner tranquility in the face of external hardship. Zeno's teachings would go on to influence generations of philosophers and statesmen, from the emperor Marcus Aurelius to the former slave Epictetus. But his own life story is perhaps the most powerful testament to the enduring human capacity for resilience and self-reinvention. In a world where brutality and suffering were the norm, Zeno and countless others like him found a way to transcend their circumstances and leave a lasting mark on history. Their example reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has the power to endure and overcome. As we come to the end of our journey through the annals of ancient Greece, it is worth reflecting on the lessons this fascinating and forbidding world can teach us. For all its lofty achievements in art, literature, and philosophy, ancient Greece was undeniably a harsh and unforgiving place, where the weak and unlucky often faced a grim fate. But it was also a world of incredible resilience and adaptability, where ordinary men and women found ways to carve out meaningful lives in the face of unimaginable adversity. From the Spartan warrior to the Athenian slave, from the common farmer to the wealthy aristocrat, each in their own way contributed to the rich tapestry of Greek history and culture. As we drift off to sleep, let us hold these ancient Greeks in our thoughts, their triumphs and tragedies, their joys and sorrows, their enduring legacy on the world we inhabit today. And let us draw strength and inspiration from their example, knowing that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit has the power to endure and overcome. Good night, dear listener, and sweet dreams. Until we meet again on the morrow for another journey through the mists of time. The slave trade was a harsh reality in ancient Greece, with countless lives bought and sold as mere property. Slaves were acquired through various means, including warfare, piracy, and even debt bondage. Many Greeks found themselves enslaved due to the whims of fate or the misfortunes of poverty. One of the most notorious sources of slaves was the Thracian kingdom to the north. The Thracians were renowned for their fierce warriors, but also for their steady supply of captured peoples to the Greek slave markets. The Athenian historian Thucydides recounts how the Athenians enslaved the entire island of Melos after a brutal siege, killing the men and selling the women and children into servitude. The Greek poet Homer, in his epic tales of gods and heroes, also offers glimpses into the bleak institution of slavery. In the Odyssey, the hero Odysseus describes the harrowing experience of being enslaved by the nymph Calypso on her island. Even a legendary figure like Odysseus was not immune to the grim fate of bondage. For a more intimate portrait, consider the tale of Aesop, the famous fabulist of ancient Greece. According to historical accounts, Aesop began his life as a slave on the island of Samos in the 6th century BC. He was described as physically deformed and mute, but possessed a keen wit and talent for crafting moral stories. As a slave, Aesop would have endured backbreaking labor, meager rations, and the constant threat of punishment from his masters. Yet through his cleverness and guile, he reportedly earned his freedom and went on to win great fame for his wise animal fables. Aesop's story, while remarkable, highlights the bleak reality that even the most brilliant minds could be shackled by the chains of slavery. The practice of debt bondage was another path into slavery for many Greeks. In a world without bankruptcy protections, those who fell into debt could be forced to sell themselves or their family members into servitude. The Athenian lawmaker Solon sought to address this crisis in the early 6th century BC by abolishing debt slavery for fellow citizens. Yet this reform did little for the many foreign slaves in Athens. Greek slavery reached its zenith in the classical period, with estimates that up to 30% of the population of some city-states consisted of enslaved people. These included the many helots of Sparta, a subjugated group treated little better than cattle by their Spartan overlords. In Athens, the great statesman Pericles himself owned as many as 50 slaves. Slaves performed all manner of tasks in Greek society, from domestic service to hard labor in the mines and fields. But perhaps the most wretched were those who toiled in the cramped, dank silver mines of Laurium near Athens. There, thousands met their doom in narrow shafts, hacking out the precious ore by the light of flickering lamps. Many likely succumbed to toxic fumes, cave-ins, or sheer exhaustion in those hellish pits. The Laurium mines were vital to funding the mighty Athenian navy that projected power across the Aegean. How bitterly ironic that this bulwark of Greek freedom and democracy rested on the scarred backs of slaves. Even in naval combat, slaves took their place as rowers in the Athenian warships, their sweat and blood greasing the gears of war and empire. Perhaps no one conveyed the bleak plight of the Greek slave better than the philosopher Diogenes. Though not a slave himself, Diogenes preached that true freedom lay in liberating oneself from all earthly needs and attachments. He famously lived in a large clay jar, embracing the life of a beggar. When asked where he came from, Diogenes simply replied, "I am a citizen of the world." In a society built on slavery and tribalism, this was a radical notion, that all humans possessed inherent dignity regardless of status. Diogenes' ideas would later influence the Stoic school of thought, which emphasized inner virtue over external circumstances. The institution of Greek slavery finally met its decline with the rise of Rome and Christianity. The Romans, while equally ruthless in conquest, offered greater possibilities for slaves to earn their freedom and become citizens. The Christian message of spiritual equality also began to chip away at the moral foundations of slavery. Yet the scars of this brutal institution lingered long in the Greek world and beyond. The wealth and splendor of Greek culture were built on the backs of nameless, faceless slaves, a fact often overlooked in our admiration for the ancients. As we ponder the glories of the Parthenon or the works of Plato, let us also remember the human toll extracted in blood and bondage. For the average slave in ancient Greece, life was often nasty, brutish, and short. They existed as little more than property, subject to the whims and abuses of their masters. Whether toiling in the fields, serving in the homes of the wealthy, or dying in the dark bowels of the mines, Greek slaves endured unimaginable hardship and cruelty. Their stories may be lost to time, but their suffering and perseverance in the face of such oppression is a testament to the indomitable nature of the human spirit. The legacy of Greek slavery is a poignant reminder of the darkness that can reside alongside the light in the annals of human civilization. Indeed, the institution of slavery was not unique to the Greek world. It has reared its ugly head in countless societies throughout history. From the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the plantations of the American South, the strong have subjugated the weak and bent them to their will. It is a shameful thread woven into the tapestry of the human story. Yet we cannot simply consign slavery to the dustbin of history, for its echoes reverberate through to the present day. Modern estimates suggest there are over 40 million people worldwide still trapped in some form of bondage or forced labor. The names and faces may have changed, but the fundamental wickedness remains. As we reflect on the grim fate of the Greek slave, let us recommit ourselves to ending such injustice and exploitation wherever it rears its head. For in a world that still bears the scars of slavery, the only way to truly honor its victims is to ensure such horrors remain firmly in the past. Only then can we begin to heal and move forward as one human family, united in dignity and compassion. But as bleak as the lives of Greek slaves undoubtedly were, their struggles and sacrifices were not entirely in vain. For in the crucible of their hardship, they helped shape a civilization whose ideas and innovations would echo through the ages. The sweat of the slave greased the gears of the Greek world, allowing it to reach dazzling heights of achievement. Would Socrates have had the leisure to ponder the nature of truth and justice without the labor of slaves to support him? Would Phidias have been able to create his breathtaking sculptures without the toil of unseen hands mining the marble? Would the Athenian democracy have flourished without the economic engine of human bondage? These are uncomfortable questions that complicate our understanding of the ancient world. We must grapple with the fact that so much of what we admire in Greek culture was inextricably linked to the brutality of slavery. It is a moral stain that cannot be scrubbed away or ignored in our appraisal of their legacy. Yet we must also recognize the fundamental humanity of the Greek slave, their hopes, dreams, and quiet acts of resistance in the face of unspeakable oppression. The playwright Aeschylus, in his tragedy The Suppliants, gives voice to a group of women fleeing forced marriage and enslavement. In their defiant words, we catch a glimpse of the fire that burned in the hearts of the downtrodden. Better to die than live a slave, and suffer outrage on my body. This spark of rebellion, however small or futile, speaks to the unquenchable yearning for freedom and dignity that resides in us all. It is a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, the human spirit finds a way to endure and resist. So let us remember the Greek slave not just as a victim, but as a vital piece of the human tapestry, one whose struggles and sacrifices helped shape the course of history. In honoring their memory, we reaffirm our commitment to a world where all people can live free from the shackles of bondage and oppression. As we ponder the grim fate of the Greek slave, we are left with a profound sense of the fragility and preciousness of human freedom. It is a right that has been hard-won through the sacrifices of countless generations, and one that we must vigilantly protect and defend. In a world still grappling with the legacy of slavery and injustice, let us draw strength from the example of those who endured and resisted in the face of unimaginable adversity. Let us honor their memory by building a society where all people can live with dignity, compassion, and respect for one another. For in the end, the story of the Greek slave is not just a tale of suffering and oppression, It is a testament to the indomitable resilience of the human spirit. It is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and the yearning for freedom can never be fully extinguished. And as we drift off to sleep, let us hold fast to that hope, that one day we may build a world where the horrors of slavery are but a distant memory, and where all people can live in the warm light of justice and equality. A world where the Aesops and the Zenos among us can rise up and take their rightful place as free and equal citizens of humanity. So let us remember the Greek slave and all those who have suffered under the yoke of bondage. Let their stories be a guiding light in our onward march towards a brighter, more compassionate future. And let us never forget the hard-won lessons of history, lest we be doomed to repeat its mistakes. With heavy hearts and hopeful spirits, we consign the nameless millions of Greek slaves to the annals of history. May they rest in power, and may their legacy endure as a beacon of resilience and a call to action for us all. And may we, the living, pick up the torch of freedom and carry it forward until all are free and the scourge of slavery is banished forever from the earth. Despite the many hardships and cruelties of life in ancient Greece, its people left an astounding legacy that echoes through the ages. The Greeks' achievements in philosophy, literature, art, architecture, and governance laid the very foundations of Western civilization as we know it today. One of the most remarkable aspects of ancient Greek culture was the emergence of a novel way of thinking, what we now call philosophy. From the bustling streets of Athens to the quiet olive groves of Miletus, a new breed of thinker arose. Men who fearlessly questioned age-old assumptions about the nature of reality, knowledge, values, reason, and the mind. These early philosophers, or lovers of wisdom, grappled with some of the most profound questions facing humanity. The first of these great thinkers is often said to be Thales of Miletus, who lived in the 6th century BCE. Thales sought to explain natural phenomena without recourse to supernatural causes or mythological stories. He boldly claimed that the fundamental substance of the universe was water, a notion that sounds rather odd to modern ears, but which represented a crucial break from the old mythological worldview. Thales ushered in a radically new naturalistic approach that would come to define Greek philosophy. Hot on the heels of Thales came other trailblazing pre-Socratic thinkers like Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Democritus. These men developed novel theories about the ultimate nature of reality, with ideas ranging from Anaximenes' claim that air is the primordial substance, to Democritus's atomic theory, which held that everything is composed of tiny, indivisible particles careening through the void. With astonishing creativity and insight, these early philosophers began to lay the conceptual groundwork for science, logic, and metaphysics. But towering over all of these impressive forerunners was the incomparable Socrates, often hailed as the father of Western philosophy. Born in Athens in 470 BCE to a humble stonemason and midwife, Socrates would go on to revolutionize Greek thought and change the intellectual trajectory of the world. Rather than propounding doctrines of his own, Socrates' great innovation was his relentless questioning method, the elenchus, or cross-examination. With surgical precision and wry wit, Socrates would interrogate his fellow Athenians about the unexamined assumptions underlying their beliefs, revealing how little they really knew. Socrates was a gadfly and provocateur, a man on a mission to expose the complacent ignorance of his age. He challenged conventional wisdom at every turn, whether deflating pompous sophists, scrutinizing traditional virtues, or casting doubt on widely accepted religious views. For Socrates, the unexamined life was not worth living, and blind obedience to authority and custom was the height of folly. He exhorted his fellow citizens to think critically for themselves, to question everything, and to pursue wisdom and virtue above all else. Alas, Socrates' rabble-rousing proved too much for the Athenian establishment to bear. In 399 BCE, at the ripe old age of 71, he was put on trial on trumped-up charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. In a stirring display of philosophical integrity, Socrates refused to renounce his views or principles, calmly accepting the death sentence and drinking the poisonous hemlock as his tearful friends looked on. Thus perished the noblest and wisest of the Greeks, yet Socrates' ideas and example would live on to inspire countless generations. Indeed, Socrates' enduring influence can be seen above all in his most brilliant protege, Plato, the thinker who did more than any other to shape the future course of Western philosophy. Born into an aristocratic Athenian family in 428 BCE, young Plato became utterly enthralled by Socrates' magnetic mind and penetrating arguments. After the master's death, Plato took up the Socratic mantle and developed an all-encompassing philosophical system of astonishing breadth and depth. At the heart of Plato's thought is his famous theory of forms, the notion that beyond the shifting, ephemeral world of appearances lies an eternal, unchanging realm of perfect archetypes. For Plato, this transcendent domain, the world of forms, is the ultimate fount of reality, goodness, and beauty. All earthly things, whether humble triangles or lofty virtues, are but imperfect reflections of their ideal forms. True knowledge thus consists in the recollection of these sublime essences which the soul once beheld directly before its descent into bodily incarnation. Equally influential was Plato's conception of the ideal state, outlined in his landmark dialogue, The Republic. Repulsed by the grubby realities of Athenian democracy, Plato envisioned a utopian society governed by wise philosopher kings, men of gold who would be specially trained in mathematics, dialectic and metaphysics. In this rigidly hierarchical system, each social class would dutifully fulfill its proper function for the good of the whole, with warriors exhibiting courage, farmers and artisans supplying necessary goods, and philosopher guardians steering the ship of state in accordance with the form of the good. While many have balked at the totalitarian and illiberal aspects of this political scheme, Plato's provocative vision continues to resonate. Perhaps no philosophical topic preoccupied Plato more than the nature of love and desire. In his Sublime Symposium, a dazzling dramatic dialogue set at a raucous Athenian drinking party, Plato expounds his infamous ladder of love theory. As articulated by the wise priestess Diotima, erotic desire for beautiful bodies is but the first rung on a heavenly ascent to ultimate reality. By learning to redirect his lust from physical to spiritual beauty, the philosophical lover is gradually initiated into the mysteries of love itself, that mighty daemon driving all creativity and revelation. The Platonic circle saw this notion of transcendent passion as the beating heart of their intellectual brotherhood, with Socratic dialectic as supreme erotics of the mind. Yet as much as he valorizes beauty and love, Plato's metaphysics carries an unmistakable ascetic streak, a distrust of the body and senses, and yearning for purified rationality. In his famous allegory of the cave, Plato depicts the majority of humans as pitiful prisoners, forever shackled in place and forced to gaze at the flickering shadows cast on the wall before them. Only the rare philosophic soul can heroically break free and ascend to the surface, where he perceives the blinding light of the sun, the form of the good, and grasps all in its true, eternal essence. This soaring image captures the otherworldly impulse pulsing through Platonism, a desire to slough off earthly illusion and take wing into eidos. Where Plato sailed off into Delphic abstractions, his ingenious pupil Aristotle brought philosophy back to earth. Born in 384 BCE in the northern outpost of Stagira, Aristotle entered Plato's academy at age 17 and rapidly rose to become the master's star student. But Aristotle was very much his own man, and as time wore on, he developed a pricklier, more empirical approach, preferring the hard data of biology to Plato's poetic flights. After Plato's death, Aristotle struck out on his own and ultimately founded his own school, the Lyceum, where he would lecture on everything from physics to poetics to metaphysics. Aristotle, quite simply, had one of the mightiest and most capacious intellects the world has ever known. He functioned almost as a one-man university, making groundbreaking contributions to a staggering array of fields: logic, rhetoric, politics, ethics, psychology, biology, astronomy, you name it. In a truly remarkable feat of systematization, Aristotle took the vast, scattered insights of his predecessors and unified them into a majestic intellectual cathedral that would structure Western thought for centuries to come. At the heart of Aristotle's philosophy is his conception of eudaimonia, or human flourishing. For Aristotle, the highest good is not Plato's abstract form, but the concrete realization of our proper function as rational political animals. We achieve eudaimonia by fully actualizing our essential nature in a life of virtue, practical wisdom, and contemplation, striking the golden mean between swinish excess and monkish asceticism. The eudaimonic man is the megalopsychos, the great-souled paragon of excellence who magnificently embodies all the classical virtues of courage, temperance, justice, magnanimity, and the rest. Aristotle's ethical philosophy is resolutely this worldly, rooted in the rough and tumble of political life rather than the ethereal glow of the Platonic empyrean. Yet, like his master Plato, Aristotle sees the highest human calling in the bios theoretikos, the contemplative life of the mind. In a few tantalizing passages towards the end of his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle rapturously describes the life of philosophical contemplation as a godlike existence of perfect blessed activity, exceeding even moral virtue in dignity and desirability. It is in these rarest moments of noetic bliss, savouring the eternal truths, that Aristotle locates the supreme human telos. The sheer scope and ambition of Aristotle's encyclopedic project is breathtaking. He wrote pioneering treatises on physics, cosmology, zoology, psychology, poetics, rhetoric, ethics, and metaphysics, leaving scarcely any intellectual stone unturned. Aristotle bequeathed to posterity an awesome architectonic system unrivaled in comprehensiveness and rigour, a magnificent synthesis of classical thought that would transfix philosophers and scientists for millennia to come. Yet if Plato and Aristotle represent the glittering apogee of Greek theoretical achievement, there were also powerful philosophical currents running in a more ethical and therapeutic direction. The Hellenistic period saw the emergence of influential schools like the Stoics, Skeptics, and Epicureans, all of whom emphasize philosophy as a practical way of life aimed at securing peace of mind and serenity of spirit. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium in the early 3rd century BCE, exalted the supremacy of reason and exhorted us to live virtuously in accordance with nature and cosmic law. For figures like Chrysippus, Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, the key to happiness lies in mastering our judgments and desires, realizing that external events are ultimately beyond our control. The sage achieves ataraxia, or freedom from disturbance, by cultivating inner detachment, accepting his fate, and dutifully playing his part in the grand providential order of the universe. The skeptics, led by Pyrrho of Elis, struck a different path to imperturbability. Whereas the Stoics achieved peace through submission to cosmic reason, the skeptics got there by suspending judgment altogether. Faced with the hopeless diversity of philosophical views and the unreliability of the senses, the wise man takes no sides, but adopts a humble attitude of non-assertion and open-minded inquiry. By embracing uncertainty and eschewing dogmatism, the skeptic avoids the psychic turmoil of the opinionated masses. Meanwhile, Epicurus of Samos taught that the most blessed life is one of modest pleasure centered around friendship, simple food, and quiet contemplation. Withdrawing from the hurly-burly of politics to cultivate his legendary garden, Epicurus saw philosophy as a soothing balm to dissolve the acid anxieties of the human heart. Against the religious superstitions of his day, Epicurus preached a form of enlightened hedonism, guided by sober prudence. The key to contentment is reining in tumultuous fears and desires, surrounding yourself with trustworthy companions, and cultivating a cheerful, self-sufficient frame of mind. What all these Hellenistic schools had in common was an overriding concern with ethics and the art of living. In an increasingly cosmopolitan and individualistic age, as the old polis-based order crumbled in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquests, Greek philosophy took a more personal and therapeutic turn. The Stoics, skeptics, and Epicureans pioneered a vision of philosophy as a noble medicine of the soul, a regimen of spiritual exercises aimed at curing psychic distress and attaining inner equanimity. This Greek eudaimonic ideal of philosophy as an eminently practical way of life would reverberate across the centuries, captivating sages and statesmen from Cicero to Thomas Jefferson. Thus, despite the blood, sweat, and tears that so often defined life in ancient Greece, this remarkable culture gave birth to a philosophical tradition of astounding creativity and enduring relevance. With their passion for critical inquiry, fearless skepticism, and rational argument, the Greeks bequeathed to humanity an inexhaustible spring of ideas that continues to nourish us today. The Western mind is forever in their debt. Perhaps nowhere is this awesome intellectual inheritance more apparent than in the sublime corpus of ancient Greek tragedy and comedy. From the spectacular festivals of Dionysus to the raucous merriment of old comedy, the Greeks displayed an unrivaled genius for dramatic art that explored the timeless tensions and perplexities of the human condition. The supreme master of Athenian tragedy was undoubtedly Sophocles, that long-lived veteran of the stage who scored an incredible 24 first-prize victories at the dramatic competitions. Born around 496 BCE into a wealthy, cultured family, Sophocles began his illustrious career at the tender age of 28, when he bested none other than Aeschylus himself. Over the next 6 decades, Sophocles would go on to produce such immortal works as Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonus and Antigone, chilling meditations on fate, knowledge and power that still transfix us 2,500 years later. What makes Sophocles' plays so endlessly compelling is their unflinching insight into the ironies and ambiguities of the human situation. At the center of his vision is the tragic hero, that larger-than-life, yet all-too-human protagonist, whose noble qualities carry the seeds of his own destruction. Whether it's the brilliant Oedipus solving the riddle of the Sphinx, only to become inextricably snared in a web of parricide and incest, or the fiercely principled Antigone defying state power in the name of divine law, Sophocles' characters grapple with agonizing moral dilemmas for which there are no easy answers. Oedipus Rex, in particular, is often hailed as the supreme masterpiece of Greek tragedy, a vertiginous plunge into the abyss of human blindness and self-ignorance. The brash young king, so confident in his Promethean intellect, relentlessly pursues the truth of his origins, only to discover that he is himself the unwitting polluter he seeks. He who once saved Thebes from the monstrous Sphinx now finds that he is the monster, a living embodiment of nature's perversity, the unclean son-husband whose very being is a violation. With savage irony, Sophocles shows how Oedipus's kingly virtues, his fierce resolve, dogged persistence, and reason lead directly to his catastrophic downfall. Every step of his investigation only entangles him further in a monstrous web of blood and darkness. And when at last the unbearable truth comes to light, the agonized Oedipus gouges out his eyes in a futile attempt to unsee what he has seen. The great solver of riddles must plunge himself into a second darkness, for some knowledge is too terrible for human eyes to bear. It is this haunting portrait of man's tragic fragility, his pitiful subjection to forces beyond his ken or control, that makes Oedipus Rex such an emotionally shattering experience. Sophocles presents the human condition in all its cruel ambiguity, our vaunted intelligence and civilization forever teetering on the edge of an irrational abyss, our noblest intentions twisted into self-destruction. With austere grandeur and unsparing insight, Sophocles rubs our noses in the radical limits of human autonomy, the way even a great and glorious king is ultimately a plaything of fate. Yet for all the bleakness of his vision, Sophocles is no nihilist. Oedipus's suffering has a kind of terrible beauty and meaning to it. By unflinchingly pursuing the truth at all costs, he achieves a paradoxical heroism even in the depths of abasement. There is something weirdly ennobling about the way Oedipus accepts total responsibility for his abominable deeds, though they were committed in blameless ignorance. Broken and polluted though he is, Oedipus attains a strange dignity in his refusal of all consolation, his granite insistence on bearing the unbearable. And though Sophocles sends his hero into a black night of misery, he also hints at a distant hope of reconciliation and redemption. In Oedipus at Colonus, the aged exiled king wanders the earth as a lowly beggar, attended by his loyal daughter Antigone. Purified through suffering, Oedipus ultimately finds forgiveness and peace in the sacred grove at Colonus, a mystical resting place that receives his weary bones. The man who once plummeted from the highest pinnacle of worldly fortune here discovers a hard-won spiritual wisdom, an acceptance of his role as an accurse. The grim fate that awaited many slaves in ancient Greece is hard to fathom in our modern age. Imagine for a moment being one of the countless souls born into bondage, your life's path determined from birth to be one of hardship and servitude. The mines of Laurium were particularly notorious for their wretched conditions. Located just south of Athens, these silver mines relied heavily on slave labor to extract the precious ore that helped finance the mighty Athenian navy. The work was grueling and perilous, hour upon back-breaking hour spent swinging pickaxes and hauling heavy loads in dark, dust-choked tunnels. Cave-ins, noxious vapors, and accidental deaths were an ever-present threat. Those who survived the dangers still faced a hellish existence of exhaustion, malnutrition, and disease. Records tell of as many as 20,000 slaves toiling in the Laurium mines during Athens' heyday in the 5th century BC. Most were war captives, ripped from their homelands by conquering armies and cast into a life of servitude. Others fell into slavery through piracy, kidnapping or crippling debts they could not repay. All found themselves stripped of rights and liberties, their worth measured only by the suffering their bodies could endure before succumbing. Glance to your left and imagine the man shackled there in the gloom, his only crime being born on the losing side of a war. To your right, a sickly boy, no older than 12, already broken by hunger and abuse. The stories that haunt these sunken, hopeless eyes could fill 1,000 histories. Yet for as long as some slaves persisted in places like Laurium, mining the silver that would adorn Athenian coins and pay Athenian mercenaries, others met a grimmer fate at sea. In times of war, thousands of unfortunate souls found themselves pulling oars as slaves in the Athenian navy, powering the mighty triremes into battle. The scholar Herodotus wrote of the Athenians' cruel treatment of the citizens of Miletos, a neighboring city-state that had rebelled against them around 494 BC. The male population was largely exterminated, but their wives and children were spared a quick death for a fate some may have considered worse. Herded onto ships, they were transported across the Aegean to live out their days as slaves. Among their grim ranks was a young boy named Histiaios. As the city burned behind them and the wailing of the doomed filled the air, he huddled against his mother on the blood-slicked deck, the two of them now bound for a life of servitude in Athens. We can only imagine the anguish and terror that must have filled young Histiaios as he watched the only home he'd ever known disappear over the horizon. As the ship pitched and rolled over the wine-dark seas, he and the other children were kept below decks, crowded into a dark, fetid hold. There was barely room to sit or lie down, and the meagre rations of stale bread and water were barely enough to keep a rat alive. Some of the younger ones succumbed to disease, their tiny bodies pitched overboard for the fish and gulls. But perhaps the worst was yet to come. For upon making port in Athens, Histiaios would have been wrenched from his mother's arms, the two of them sold off to separate fates, likely never to meet again. Such was the cruel calculus of slavery in ancient Greece, families and lovers torn apart, all bonds of kinship and affection severed in service of cold commerce. Some slaves faced a life of toil in the fields, forced to tend the wheat and olive crops that kept the Greek world fed. Others were sent to labor in the many workshops that produced the ceramics, textiles, and other goods that were the lifeblood of ancient trade. But for a young boy like Histiaios, the most likely fate was to be purchased as a household servant, interned in the home of an Athenian noble to perform menial chores. There, subject to the whims and abuses of his masters, he would have to grow up fast, learning to navigate a world of casual cruelty and institutionalized oppression. Perhaps he caught the eye of the master's lecherous gaze and was subjected to further indignities. Or maybe he found himself nursing the wounds of a beating after a dish broke or a floor went unswept. The lot of a slave in a Greek household was one of unrelenting labor and the constant specter of violence or violation. And yet, even in the face of such adversity, the human spirit endures. History records the tale of one Zeno of Citium, born a slave in the 4th century BC, who through luck and wit managed to catch the eye of a wealthy Athenian merchant. Taking pity on the clever young man, the merchant granted Zeno his freedom and financed his education. Going on to study under the great philosopher Crates of Thebes, Zeno would one day found his own school of Stoic philosophy. He taught his followers to pursue lives of virtue and restraint, accepting their fates with resolve and equanimity. One wonders how much of this was shaped by Zeno's own experiences as one of the downtrodden, a man intimate with cruelty and privation, who found within himself the strength to rise above his station and forge a legacy. But for every Zeno, for every slave who against all odds managed to transcend their brutal circumstances, thousands more lived and died in agony, forgotten by time. Theirs are the tales left untold, of young girls wrenched from their mother's arms and shoved into a life of exploitation and drudgery. Of old men, their bodies broken by a lifetime of servitude, tossed aside to expire in a ditch. Of families ripped apart, lovers torn from each other's arms, parents forced to watch their children suffer. In sleep, you can still hear their wailing through the ages, borne on the wind along with the clank of chains, the crack of whips, the sobs of the innocent and afraid. It echoes across the millennia, that chorus of misery, too terrible to contemplate. And so we return to the beginning, to the fundamental truth that life in ancient Greece, for all its vaunted philosophy and politics, was a brutal and unforgiving affair for the vast majority. A world where the strong prospered through the sweat and blood of the weak. where the vagaries of fortune could see a prince reduced to a pauper in the space of a day, a free woman enslaved for the crime of being on the losing side of a war. Perhaps that is what puts the achievements of the Greeks into their proper context, that it was a society so riven by oppression and adversity, and yet capable of such towering heights of intellect and inquiry, that for all the centuries of subjugation, that ineffable spark of curiosity and ingenuity could not be quenched in the Hellenic spirit, that from such pain and hardship, such light and beauty could still emerge. So let us spare a thought for the lonely, huddled wretch in the bowels of a slave ship, for the starving miner choking in the dust of Laurium, for the battered servant toiling thanklessly in the heat of the day, for it is on their scarred and broken backs that the glittering edifice of Greek civilization was built. And in the end, when the columns have crumbled to dust and the last echoes of the epics have faded from memory, it is their struggles and their sacrifice we must strain to recall. These vanished multitudes who lived, suffered, and died in the shadow of the Acropolis. For theirs is the truest, most enduring history of ancient Greece. Despite the cruel realities of daily life, ancient Greeks also managed to find moments of joy, beauty, and meaning amidst the struggle. Festivals and religious rituals provided occasional respite from the hardship, bringing the community together in shared celebration. One of the most famous examples were the Great Dionysia, held each spring in Athens to honor the god Dionysus. For a few precious days, the city's poets, actors, and playwrights took center stage, mesmerizing audiences with their performances. At times like these, even poor farmers and slaves could bask in leisure and revelry, enjoying wine, dance, and beloved fables brought to life. The renowned playwright Sophocles crafted some of his masterpieces for these festivals, including the timeless tragedies of Oedipus Rex and Antigone. With their soaring poetry and piercing insights into the human condition, these stories offered catharsis and meaning to a populace who knew all too well the cruelty and chaos of the world. While few could ever hope to attain the sublime artistry of a Sophocles, the Dionysia inspired an appreciation for theatre and storytelling that permeated Greek society. Even in small villages, local bards and minstrels regaled the public with tales of gods and heroes around the campfire. These myths, passed down through generations, helped the Greeks make sense of their harsh existence. They wove a rich tapestry of meaning that elevated the mortal experience and gave the people an identity beyond mere survival. For example, consider the famous tale of Persephone, the goddess of spring growth, and her annual return from the underworld. This beloved myth helped explain the turning of the seasons, Persephone emerging from the land of the dead each spring to bring the earth back to life, only to return below again in winter. For farmers toiling away under the scorching Mediterranean sun, the story of Persephone connected their daily labours to the grand cycles of death and rebirth that govern the cosmos. It imbued their struggles with profound spiritual purpose. The myths also provided moral instruction and cautionary examples to guide the Greeks in their daily lives. The Odyssey, Homer's epic poem, told of the heroic Odysseus and his long, perilous journey home after the Trojan War. Along the way, he had to outsmart deadly threats like the monstrous Cyclops Polyphemus and resist temptations like the bewitching song of the sirens. To the Greeks, Odysseus embodied the virtues of cunning, fortitude, and faithfulness that they all needed to navigate life's hardships. His story inspired them to keep enduring and striving, no matter what the gods or fate threw their way. These myths weren't just idle entertainment. They were a survival tool, a way to find courage and wisdom in the face of a bleak, unpredictable existence. They elevated the Greeks from mere subsistence to a people with a proud, storied heritage and identity. And at festivals like the Dionysia, that heritage was constantly renewed, the old tales revisited and reinterpreted by each new generation of poets and playwrights. But festivals were also an opportunity to honor and celebrate the gods, whose favor was essential for any kind of good fortune in life. The Greeks believed that their deities controlled every aspect of the world, from the weather to the outcome of battles. They lived in constant awe and fear of the gods, knowing that any moment their wrath could bring ruinous misfortune down upon their heads. To appease these powerful but fickle beings, the Greeks performed endless sacrifices and rituals, according to precisely detailed rules and traditions. During festivals, the blood of oxen, goats, and sheep flowed freely as offerings to Athena, Apollo, Poseidon, and the rest of the sprawling pantheon. Altars smoked with burning meat and incense as priests chanted sacred hymns. The austere Spartans were particularly fastidious in honoring the gods, believing their favor was the secret to their military might. Before marching off to war, Spartan soldiers always sought divine approval with solemn rites and sacrifices. But not all rituals were so grim. Many festivals were joyous, colorful affairs that offered a chance to cut loose and revel in earthly pleasures. Dancers whirled to vibrant music, while acrobats and jugglers performed to the delight of the crowds. Lively processions wound through the streets, with participants dressed as satyrs, nymphs, and other mythical beings. It was a time to cast off the weary burdens of everyday life and indulge in merriment and spectacle. Even the great thinker Aristotle argued for the importance of such festivities, which he called the highest form of human activity. Of course, not everyone got to partake equally in these celebrations. They often reinforced the rigid hierarchies of Greek society, with seating and participation carefully regulated by class and status. Women were mostly excluded from public revelry, confined to the domestic sphere even during festivals. And needless to say, slaves were too busy serving the needs and whims of their masters to enjoy much leisure. So while these respites from the daily grind offered hope and relief to many Greeks, they couldn't erase the underlying brutality and inequity that plagued their world. Behind every extraordinary work of art or moment of merriment lay the mundane suffering that defined life for most people, the backbreaking labor, the constant specter of war and disease, the oppression of women, and the wretched exploitation of slaves. This was the bleak canvas on which the Greeks painted their moments of light. And inevitably, each festival had to end, the music falling silent, the crowds dispersing, the beautiful costumes packed away. Farmers returned to their fields, soldiers to their barracks, women to their looms, and slaves to their labors. In this sense, festivals were almost a bittersweet tease, a fleeting glimpse of a life not defined by hardship before returning to grim reality. But the memories of those experiences and the myths, traditions, and beliefs they renewed helped sustain the Greeks through the unrelenting challenges of their existence. The fables of wily Odysseus and eternal Persephone, the prayers offered in sacred temples, the cathartic tragedies of Sophocles, the joyous dances honoring Dionysus. These things knit the Greeks together as a people and gave them a shared source of meaning and identity beyond mere survival. United by piety, heritage, and a common fate, they could endure the cruelest turns of history with resilience and even a measure of grace. Thanks to these shared mythic and cultural touchstones, a Greek farmer could see his own trials reflected in the labors of Heracles, could understand his place in a greater story. At the theatre or the temple, a poor woman could feel herself part of something larger than her narrow, confined world, connected to the great chain of being. Hearing the Homeric tales, even the lowliest slave could walk a little taller, knowing they came from a tradition of greatness. And so, year after year, century after century, the Greeks endured and persevered through unimaginable hardship. Though their world was in many ways brutal and unforgiving, their rich culture and unshakable spirit allowed them to rise above the constant struggle of life, to assert their humanity in the face of pain, cruelty, and chaos. In the mythic heroes and pious rituals they celebrated, the Greeks found the inspiration to keep striving for virtue and glory in an uncertain world. That tenacity and resilience would fuel some of the most stunning achievements in human history, from the grand temples of the Acropolis to the groundbreaking philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. And it all emerged from the harsh crucible of a brutal existence, a testament to the sheer fortitude of the Greek people. But let's turn our focus now to a few key historical figures who exemplified both the challenges and triumphs of this unforgiving world. Figures whose extraordinary lives left an indelible mark on the Greek landscape and the greater arc of history. By examining these remarkable characters, we can better understand the human element behind the sweeping currents of the ancient Mediterranean. The first of these figures is the legendary Athenian statesman and reformer Solon. Born into a noble family around 630 BCE, Solon came of age in a time of crisis and upheaval for his city-state. Decades of simmering tensions between the aristocratic landowners and the increasingly impoverished peasantry had brought Athens to the brink of collapse. Farmers who had fallen into debt were being sold into slavery, while a handful of elite families tightened their grip on wealth and power. As a respected voice of moderation, Solon was appointed chief magistrate in 594 BCE and tasked with resolving this crisis before it tore the city apart. He responded with a series of bold but carefully balanced reforms that would reshape Athenian society for generations to come. First and foremost, Solon outlawed the practice of debt slavery, ensuring that no Athenian would ever again be enslaved to a creditor. He ordered the immediate release of all those currently bonded and arranged for the return of farmers who had been sold abroad. This lifted a huge burden off the backs of the common people and began to ease the seething resentment against the wealthy elite. At the same time, Solon refused demands to redistribute land from rich to poor, likely understanding that stripping the nobles of their wealth would only destabilize the city further. Instead, he worked to create more opportunity for enterprising commoners to acquire property and advance their station through hard work and thrift. He encouraged the cultivation of olives and grapes for export, opening up new avenues for farmers to profit. Solon also made participation in civic affairs a duty for all citizens, rich and poor alike. He established a people's court where any male citizen could bring a case or serve as a juror, regardless of class. This gave the common people a greater stake and voice in the governance of their society. But he also maintained the aristocratic council of the Areopagus as a check on the power of the masses, ensuring that experienced elites still had a role in guiding the state. Perhaps most revolutionary of all, Solon changed the basis of political power from birth to wealth. He divided all citizens into 4 classes based on their annual agricultural output, with each class granted a corresponding degree of political rights and responsibilities. While still far from a true democracy, this system allowed successful farmers and artisans to rise into positions of authority, breaking the stranglehold of the old aristocratic bloodlines. Solon's deft reforms helped release the pressure building within Athens and laid the groundwork for its later flourishing. But this great visionary was no starry-eyed utopian. He understood all too well the grimmer realities of human nature and the world around him. "Laws are like spiders' webs," he once remarked. "They will catch the weak and poor, but would be torn to pieces by the rich and powerful." Indeed, Solon had little illusion that life for the common Athenian would ever be anything but a harsh struggle. Even after his reforms, the lot of farmers, laborers, and slaves remained one of relentless toil and deprivation from dawn to dusk. He knew that the powerful would always seek to dominate and exploit the weak in a world of scarce resources and constant conflict. But Solon's genius lay in recognizing that a society is most stable and prosperous when it gives each segment of its population some stake in the greater good, some reason to identify with the body politic. By softening the rough edges of aristocratic domination and offering the lower classes a measure of security and participation, he helped knit his polis together and invested its citizens with a deeper loyalty and fellow feeling. Solon's example would inspire Greek statesmen and philosophers for centuries to come, from Cleisthenes, the father of Athenian democracy, to Aristotle, who saw in Solon's reforms a model of moderate mixed government. His wisdom, moderation, and skillful statecraft set the tone for the best of the Greek political tradition. If Solon represented the ideals of balance, restraint, and compromise in the face of social upheaval, our next key figure embodied a very different set of values, those of unflinching martial courage and self-sacrifice. I speak of none other than King Leonidas of Sparta, the legendary warrior who led 300 of his men to glorious death against the invading Persians at Thermopylae. The story of Leonidas and his 300 has been told and retold down through the centuries, immortalized in poetry, art, and film. It has become the archetype of the doomed but defiant last stand, the ultimate expression of the Spartan creed of honor and martial prowess. But to understand the true impact of this hero's sacrifice, we must first examine the context in which it occurred, a time of existential peril for the Greek world. The year was 480 BCE, and the mighty Persian Empire under Xerxes I was determined to conquer the divided and squabbling Greek city-states once and for all. For over a century, the Greeks had managed to frustrate the designs of the great kings through their stubborn independence and military ingenuity. But now Xerxes had assembled a massive multinational army, drawing contingents from every corner of his vast domains, determined to crush the Hellenes with overwhelming force. Ancient sources claim this host numbered in the millions, though modern historians believe a few 100,000 is more likely. Regardless of the precise figures, it was clear that the Greeks faced an existential threat like none they had ever seen. A wave of panic and despair washed over the city-states as they grappled with the enormity of the Persian war juggernaut bearing down on them. Many openly considered surrender or neutrality rather than face annihilation. But the Spartans, led by their kings Leonidas and Leotychidas, took a very different view. As the recognized masters of land warfare, the legendary warrior elite saw the Persian invasion as the ultimate test of Spartan valor and discipline. Where others counseled caution, they yearned for a glorious confrontation that would ring through the ages. When a Persian envoy arrived in Sparta demanding the ritual offering of earth and water as symbols of submission, Leonidas's reply was curt and characteristically laconic. "Dig it out for yourselves." With those words, he committed his polis to a fight to the death against the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. But the Spartans could not take on the Persians alone. They needed to rally the other city-states to put aside their squabbles and unite in common defense. Under Leonidas' leadership, they convened a Hellenic League and sent out a call for each state to muster its fighting men and meet the Persians in battle. The response was underwhelming, to say the least. Many city-states dithered, bickered, and wavered in the face of the oncoming storm. Old rivalries and grievances bubbled to the surface, paralyzing collective action. Athens and Sparta nearly came to blows over which would command the allied navy. And all the while, the Persian host marched inexorably closer, subjugating or bypassing Greek settlements in its path. In the end, only a small coalition of city-states rallied to Leonidas's side, mustering a force of some 7,000 men to block the Persian advance at the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae. The Spartan king knew this position was highly defensible, but not indefinitely so. Eventually the Persians would either break through or find a way around. But he hoped that a heroic stand might galvanize the rest of the Greeks to unite and muster a larger force to defeat the invaders. And so Leonidas led his 300 Spartans, along with contingents from Thebes, Thespiae, and other allies, to make that stand at the hot gates. For 2 brutal days, the Greeks held the pass against a wave after wave of Persian assaults, inflicting massive casualties. The Spartan warriors were in their element, their lifelong training and discipline paying off as they fought in tight phalanx formation, rotating fresh troops to the front to maintain a wall of bristling spear points. Contemporary accounts speak of the Spartans' utter fearlessness and ferocity in this close-quarters bloodbath. Herodotus describes the heroism of Dionysus, who upon hearing that the Persian arrows would blot out the sun, remarked, "So much the better, we shall fight in the shade." Another Spartan warrior, Polyaenus, was said to have slain a charging Persian cavalry officer with a single mighty throw of a stone. But on the 3rd day of battle, the Greeks' fate was sealed by an act of betrayal. A local shepherd named Ephialtes revealed to the Persians a mountain path that would allow them to outflank the pass. Leonidas, learning of this development, dismissed the bulk of the Greek forces to save them from annihilation. He and his 300 Spartans, along with a contingent of Thebans and Thespians, would remain to guard the retreat, fighting to the last man. In those final hours, knowing death was certain, it's said that Leonidas turned to his men and declared, "Eat a hearty breakfast, men, for tonight we dine in Hades." And then the doomed heroes charged into the fray one last time, determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible and carve an immortal legend into history. The details of that final stand are forever lost to us, but one can imagine the awful carnage and valor of those blood-soaked moments. The Spartans would have formed a circle facing outward, holding their ground to the last against the Persian onslaught, even as they were overwhelmed. Ancient sources claimed that Leonidas himself fought like a man possessed, felling Persians left and right until he succumbed to a hail of arrows. His men then fought tooth and nail over his body, determined to deny the enemy this trophy, until the grim fate of slaves in ancient Greece was perhaps the most harrowing and heartbreaking aspect of this brutal, unforgiving world. Slavery was not just widespread, it formed the very backbone of the Greek economy and way of life. In Athens alone, it's estimated that slaves made up a staggering 1/3 of the total population. These poor souls, ripped from their homelands by war or piracy, faced the bleakest of circumstances. Slaves were viewed as mere property, not people. They could be bought, sold, beaten and killed with impunity. Most were forced to perform backbreaking labor from dawn to dusk in the fields, mines, workshops and galleys, yoked like beasts of burden. They subsisted on meager rations of bread and water, living in squalid, cramped quarters. Escape or rebellion meant torture and execution. It was a wretched, hopeless existence. The most nightmarish fate was perhaps reserved for the thousands of slaves toiling in the silver mines of Laurium near Athens. This was the ancient equivalent of a concentration camp or gulag. Men, women and children were condemned to work in hellish conditions, extracting the precious ore that funded the Athenian navy. They labored naked in narrow, suffocating shafts, breathing toxic dust that scarred their lungs. Many were literally worked to death. The Greek writer Xenophon coldly remarked that the mine owners sought out slaves who had a strong physique for the work, but whose spirit had been broken by ill treatment. For many of these unfortunate souls, the only escape was death. But there were a few remarkable individuals who overcame the overwhelming odds and rose above their station. One was Zeno of Citium, the founder of the philosophy of Stoicism. Born around 300 BC in Cyprus, Zeno began his life as a lowly slave in Athens. But through sheer brilliance and force of will, he gained his freedom and went on to establish one of the most influential philosophical schools of antiquity. According to the ancient biographer Diogenes Laertius, Zeno arrived in Athens as a young merchant, but was shipwrecked and lost everything. Alone and destitute, he was sold into slavery. While browsing a bookshop one day, he chanced upon the works of Socrates and was inspired to study philosophy. Impressing his master with his keen mind, Zeno was freed and soon began teaching. As a former slave himself, Zeno displayed a remarkable empathy and humanity towards the downtrodden. He taught that all people, regardless of status, shared a common reason and divine spark. Stoicism emphasized virtues of self-discipline, devotion to duty, and inner fortitude even in the face of great adversity and suffering, qualities that no doubt resonated with many slaves. Zeno's wise words gave them a spiritual liberation, even if their bodies remained in chains. The sheer inhumanity and trauma of slavery left deep scars on Greek society and the psyche of its victims. Many slaves internalized their oppression and resigned themselves to their awful lot. But a few extraordinary figures like Zeno managed to transcend the shackles of slavery through the power of ideas and strength of character. They remain an inspiring testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable hardship. Despite its soaring cultural and intellectual achievements, there's no denying that ancient Greece was a cruel, harsh world for the vast majority of its inhabitants. For every brilliant philosopher or celebrated warrior, there were countless forgotten slaves, peasants and paupers struggling to survive. They eked out a meager living, toiling under the broiling Mediterranean sun, always one failed harvest or invasion away from destitution and death. But in a strange way, this legacy of strife and hardship may have been what forged the Greeks' legendary drive, ingenuity and grit. Overcoming such adversity required resilience, tenacity and toughness, both physical and mental. These hard-won virtues carried over into their cultural, artistic and political pursuits. Indeed, the Greeks seemed to pour all their pent-up pain, rage and yearning into their immortal works of art, architecture and philosophy, and thus alchemize their suffering into timeless glory. So when we gaze upon the austere beauty of the Parthenon or ponder the sage wisdom of Socrates, we must remember the blood, sweat and tears that made it all possible, and the countless, nameless souls whose tragic sacrifice paved the way. For it was their sorrow and subjugation that was the hidden bedrock upon which the lofty achievements of the Greek Golden Age were built. Without them, the dazzling light of ancient Greece would have been unthinkable. Of course, the Greeks were far from alone in this cruel calculus. Nearly every great civilization, from the Romans to the Egyptians to the Aztecs, was erected upon the backs of the oppressed and exploited underclasses. Slavery, serfdom, and institutionalized inequality have tragically been the norm, not the exception, for most of human history. It's a sober reminder of the tremendous moral progress we've made since then, and the constant vigilance needed to protect it. And yet, even amidst such unremitting bleakness, the human spirit endured and found a way to shine through. The Greeks, despite their myriad flaws and contradictions, gave us many of our highest ideals: democracy, justice, beauty, truth. They dared to dream of a world of reason, harmony and human dignity, even if they so often fell short of it. That vision of a more perfect world, however faint and fleeting, lit the way forward through the long, dark night of history. So as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for the many souls who suffered greatly so that these precious gifts could be passed down through the ages. May we honor their sacrifice by continuing to reach for that more enlightened future that they glimpsed against all odds so long ago in the magnificent struggle that was ancient Greece. Perhaps there is a nobility in strife after all, a strange and sacred alchemy that transmutes our mortal agony into immortal gold, the auriferous ore of the soul, the gleaming substance of civilization itself. And in that sense, the bitter tears of Hellas watered rich gardens that are still yielding fruit to this day. The life of a Greek slave was one of unending toil, hardship, and suffering. Slaves had no rights or legal protections, and were viewed as mere property to be used and exploited by their masters. The Greek philosopher Aristotle even argued that slavery was a natural state, and that some people were simply born to be slaves. One of the worst places to be a slave in ancient Greece was in the bleak, windswept silver mines of Laurium, about 50 miles south of Athens. Here, thousands of slaves, including women and children, were forced to work in cramped, filthy, dangerous conditions, hewing the precious silver ore that helped finance the mighty Athenian navy. The mines were dark, poorly ventilated tunnels that extended hundreds of feet underground. Slaves worked in oppressive heat, choked with dust, their lungs gradually blackening from breathing the fine stone particles. Cave-ins, accidents, and toxic gases claimed countless lives. But the greatest killer was simply overwork and exhaustion. Slaves toiled for 10 hours a day or more, hauling baskets of ore, swinging picks and hammers until their hands bled and their muscles gave out. They subsisted on meager rations of bread and water. Rest was brief, and sleep was snatched in dank, vermin-infested pits next to the mine face. Most miners, broken and used up, didn't survive more than a few years in these hellish conditions. When they died, they were simply tossed aside into unmarked graves to be replaced by fresh victims rounded up from the markets. The Laurium mines devoured slaves by the thousands, fueling the wealth of the Athenian upper classes and the might of their empire. Not all slaves in ancient Greece met quite such a grim fate, but their lives were still filled with constant work, poverty, and fear. In Athens alone, enslaved people made up a third or more of the total population. Many were foreigners, seized as war captives, or bought from slave traders. Others fell into slavery through debt or were simply born into servitude. Slaves worked in virtually every sector of the economy, toiling as miners, farmhands, factory workers, rowers in the fleet, or domestic servants. Household slaves who attended to the needs of wealthier Greek families might be treated somewhat better than those sentenced to harder physical labor, but their existence was still precarious. A slave could be punished, sold off, or abused on a whim by their masters. There was no escape from this life of servitude. Runaway slaves, if caught, faced brutal floggings, branding, or even execution. Their best hope was that they might, perhaps, be granted freedom by a kindly master after decades of loyal service in old age. But for most, slavery was a life sentence of grinding work and bondage. The story of one famous former slave sheds light on just how unjust and arbitrary the Greek slave system could be. In the 4th century BC, a merchant ship bound for Athens was shipwrecked off the coast of Greece. The only survivor was a young Phoenician man named Zeno. Stripped of everything, alone in a foreign land, Zeno had no means to repay the cost of his rescue. He was promptly sold into slavery. Fate, however, took an unexpected turn. Zeno's keen intellect caught the attention of his master, a wealthy Athenian named Crates. Instead of hard labor, Crates set Zeno to work in his library, studying philosophy. In time, impressed by Zeno's fierce intelligence, Crates granted him his freedom and introduced him to other philosophers. Zeno would go on to become one of ancient Greece's most brilliant minds, the founder of the influential Stoic school of philosophy. Zeno's improbable rise from lowly slave to celebrated philosopher was the exception, not the rule, in a Greek society where the practice of slavery was ruthlessly entrenched. The grand ideas that Zeno and other Greek thinkers debated, of reason, justice, goodness, rarely applied to the faceless thousands who toiled in bondage and hardship, powering the engine of Greek civilization. So, when we look back at the remarkable achievements of the ancient Greeks, their soaring temples and gleaming statues, their refined art and literature, their profound innovations in politics, philosophy, and science, we must remember the high human cost that made it all possible. The hidden story of ancient Greece is a tale of blood, sweat, and tears, the brutal, thankless struggle of the countless common folk, the slaves, servants, and peasants whose names are lost to history. For all its wonders and glories, ancient Greece could be a pitiless, unforgiving world if you were not lucky enough to be born into the ranks of the privileged few. It was a society that didn't hesitate to exploit the weak and turn a blind eye to their suffering. And this harsh legacy would endure for centuries to come, through the Roman period and beyond. Systems of slavery, serfdom, and forced labor would remain entrenched throughout much of the classical world. It would take until modern times for the ideals of universal human rights and freedoms to slowly, painfully take root. So as we marvel at humanity's first faltering steps towards democracy, philosophy, and high culture in ancient Greece, we must grapple with this darker side of the classical legacy as well. The Greeks laid the foundations for so much of what we value in Western civilization today, but they also bequeath to us more troubling traditions of social inequality, domination, and subjugation that we're still struggling to overcome. In the end, the true story of ancient Greece wasn't the shining white marble of the Parthenon or the noble words of Socrates and Plato. It was the cries of the desperate and downtrodden, the fears of the powerless, the injustices endured by the many so that a few might prosper. It was a bittersweet symphony of the highs and lows of the human condition. We celebrate the ancient Greeks for their triumphs, but we must also mourn what they suffered. And in that suffering, we can perhaps see the crucible in which the ideals we still cherish today were painfully forged, the notions of compassion, equality, and human dignity that have taken so many centuries to flower. Ancient Greece, immortal and inimitable, was a land of towering genius and achievements. But it was also built upon the bowed and broken backs of the anonymous oppressed. As we close our eyes and drift into sleep, let us dream of a world where the marvels of human invention can flourish without such a cost in human misery. A world the Greeks gave us the first glimpse of, even if they themselves could not fully reach it. The grim fate that awaited many Greek slaves was perhaps most shockingly embodied by the thousands of wretches who toiled ceaselessly in the infamous silver mines of Laurium. Located in a barren region southeast of Athens, these tunnels and shafts delved deep into the earth, following veins of silver-bearing lead ore. This precious metal was vital to Athens' burgeoning economy and imperial ambitions. But it came at a horrific human cost. The mines were worked entirely by slaves, many of them prisoners of war, debtors, or simply those unlucky enough to be born into bondage. They labored in appalling conditions, hacking away at the rock in sweltering, cramped tunnels by the light of flickering oil lamps. The air was foul with dust and fumes. Many suffered grievous injuries from falls, collapsing tunnels, or the chronic effects of breathing the toxic air. Life expectancy in the mines of Laurium was pitifully short. Few survived more than a year or two of this nightmarish existence before succumbing to disease, malnutrition, or accidents. Yet the flow of silver and fresh bodies to replace the fallen never ceased. Unimaginable wealth for the Athenian state was purchased by unimaginable suffering. The quota each slave was required to produce was high, and the overseers who stalked the tunnels were notoriously brutal. Beatings and mutilations were commonplace for those who faltered in their ceaseless toil. There was no rest and no respite. When one slave collapsed, they would simply be dragged away to die out of sight, and another, unfortunate, would be thrust into their place. It's impossible for us now to truly conceive of the horror and hopelessness that these poor, benighted souls endured. To be cast into the dank, hellish tunnels of Laurium was to enter a world cut off from the light in every sense, devoid of any comfort, kindness, or dignity, where death was the only release. Yet their plight was simply accepted as an unremarkable fact of life. The great cradle of democracy depended foundationally on their mute suffering. But occasionally, a fluke of fate could transform a slave's destiny in the most dramatic way imaginable. One of the most famous examples is the remarkable story of Zeno of Citium. Born around 334 BC in the Greek city-state of Citium on Cyprus, Zeno began his life as a slave. Details of his early life are scarce, but at some point, Zeno found himself shipwrecked near Athens. Wandering into a bookshop, he became engrossed in the works of the philosopher Xenophon, a student of Socrates. Zeno had found his calling. Impressed by his keen mind and determination, his master granted him freedom to pursue his studies. Against all odds, Zeno flourished in his adopted city. He studied under the eminent Cynic philosopher Crates of Thebes, but soon founded his own school of thought that became known as Stoicism. Stoic teachings of virtue, asceticism, and inner tranquility resonated powerfully in a world fraught with upheaval and adversity. Zeno's works were studied and admired by luminaries from Scipio Africanus to Cicero and Seneca. Stoicism became one of the most influential philosophies in the Greco-Roman world, and Zeno himself was revered as one of the great sages of Athens. It's a truly extraordinary trajectory, from anonymous slave to towering giant of classical philosophy. Zeno's story may seem like one in a million, and indeed his full-circle odyssey from bondage to acclaim is singularly impressive. But it does underscore that the boundaries between slave and free in ancient Greece were not always impermeable. Slaves were not some separate species, but human beings with human potential. And under some circumstances, even a slave could transcend their degraded status and achieve great things. The Athenian general and statesman Timotheus, for instance, was said to be the son of a Thracian slave woman. The poet Philoxenus of Cythera and the fabulist Aesop were also believed to have begun life as slaves. For a lucky, infinitesimal few, slavery could occasionally be a prelude to prominence, rather than a life sentence of drudgery and despair. But for the vast majority, there would be no such redemption. Their dismal lot was simply to endure, to eke out a meagre, constricted, and doubtless abbreviated existence in the shadow of the free. The institution of slavery was one of the pillars that held up the grand edifice of classical Greek civilization. But that gleaming mantle concealed an ocean of misery, lives ground down by relentless exploitation, scarred by systematic brutality and cruel dehumanization. It's an unavoidable paradox at the heart of ancient Greece's complex legacy. As ancient Greece lurched into the 4th century BC, the widening scourge of warfare would unleash new waves of devastation and social upheaval. Mighty Athens and Sparta, after decades of ruinous conflict in the Peloponnesian War, were greatly diminished. A power vacuum loomed. Into this breach would stride the dynamic young kingdom of Macedon, led by its most illustrious ruler, Alexander the Great. Alexander's brief but meteoric career would spark a new age of Greek civilization, the Hellenistic period. But before that sprawling cultural flowering, Alexander's vaulting ambition would first usher in a scale of bloodshed unlike anything the Greek world had yet seen. Born in 356 BC to King Philip II of Macedon, Alexander was groomed for supremacy from an early age. He counted the great philosopher Aristotle among his tutors, but Alexander's true genius was for the art of war. When Philip was murdered in 336 BC, Alexander ascended the throne at the tender age of 20. Immediately, he set his sights on the east and on etching his name in history. With an elite army of battle-hardened Macedonian troops, Alexander embarked on a campaign of conquest that would ultimately range over 20,000 miles, forge an empire stretching from Greece to India, and enshrine his name as a byword for martial glory to this day. Alexander's army, with its crack-heavy cavalry and nearly invincible Sarissa pikemen, proved a formidable machine of conquest as he led them first into Persia, toppling the mighty Achaemenid Empire, then to Egypt, where he was hailed as a divine pharaoh, and as far as the banks of the river Indus in 326 BC. Everywhere he marched, Alexander left a trail of subjugated cities and shattered armies in his wake. Fabled bastions like Tyre and Gaza were reduced to rubble, their surviving populaces sold en masse into slavery. At the climactic Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, Alexander was said to have slew over 50,000 Persians in a single day, turning the battlefield into a charnel house of hacked and trampled flesh. While marvelously successful in the field, Alexander's blazing ambition came at a harrowing human price wherever his armies appeared. His increasingly despotic style brought purges and paranoia within his own ranks as well. When his beloved companion Hephaestion died in 324 BC, Alexander, unhinged by grief, massacred an entire tribe in the Hindu Kush as human sacrifices for the funeral. By the time Alexander himself died, aged just 32, from an alcohol-fueled fever, he had carved out one of the largest realms the world had ever seen. But the breathtaking scale and speed of his achievements were matched by the toll in blood and suffering. Hundreds of thousands had perished, and whole societies were left reeling in his scorched earth wake. Alexander's abrupt death would send shockwaves through his fragile young empire, sparking power struggles between his generals that splintered the realm into warring dynasties. The Hellenistic world that emerged would be a crucible of cultural fusion and intellectual ferment, but also an arena for chronic conflict and political upheaval. Life for the common Greek would remain as turbulent and precarious as ever. Looming over all of this strife and insecurity was the ever-present shadow of death. For all its glittering achievements, ancient Greek society could do shockingly little to parry the mortal realities of accident, injury, or illness. With no real conception of germ theory or antisepsis, even the most mundane-seeming wound or malady could easily prove fatal. Childhood was especially perilous. Perhaps half of all Greek children did not survive to adulthood. Infectious diseases, from dysentery to typhoid fever, cut swathes through the population in periodic epidemics. Chronic ailments, like tuberculosis and malaria, sapped the strength and livelihood of untold multitudes. The practice of medicine in ancient Greece, though increasingly systematized and observational, still relied heavily on erroneous theories of the body and had only primitive surgical capabilities. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, purging, and often toxic medicaments as much as they dispensed sound advice for healthy living. Patients with grave conditions could only place their hope in the favor of the gods. For those whom fortune preserved into old age, senescence itself could be a drawn-out torment in a world so lacking in palliative care. The elderly often faced increasing isolation, infirmity, and privation if they lacked family to support them. The fabled Athenian statesman Pericles himself was said to have wasted away in agony, his once brilliant mind unraveled after contracting the plague that ravaged Athens in 430 BC. Death, when it finally came, was an event far more raw and visceral than we can neatly imagine. There were no hospitals or hospices, no analgesics or life support to ease or forestall the inevitable. The moribund would breathe their last on a simple pallet at home, or on the open battlefield, encircled at best by their loved ones. Funeral rites were an essential duty for Greek families, who washed and anointed the body, conducted lamentations, and oversaw burial or cremation. Even these sacred rituals could not soften the brute reality of death in a pre-modern world, as one more soul slipped into the shadows of Hades, and one more branch was pruned from the tree of life. This, then, is the sobering mosaic of daily existence that lurked behind the towering intellectual, artistic, and political triumphs of the ancient Greeks. It's a portrait of life at its most elemental and unadorned, shorn of the mediating comforts and safeguards that we take for granted. From the Athenian farmer, grimly labouring to wrest sustenance from the stingy soil, to the Spartan helot, crushed under the jackboot of a pitiless warrior elite. From the plague-ridden streets of Periclean Athens to the howling death pits of the Peloponnesian War, the common Greek was locked in an unrelenting struggle for survival against foes both human and elemental. It was, in every sense, a world as harsh and abrasive as it could be vibrant and inspiring, a crucible that demanded every ounce of fortitude and guile that the human spirit could muster. That Greek civilization accomplished so much, while sailing into the teeth of such unremitting adversity, must stand eternally to their credit. But it's also a poignant reminder of the nameless, numberless ranks of ordinary Greeks who shouldered the weight of those achievements without tasting their fruits. Those who endured, as the poet Hesiod wrote, toiling ceaselessly like the bees in the spring, when they feed and rear the grubs, working themselves to death. Poor things, because they keep at it all day long from sunrise to sunset. In grappling with the ancient Greek experience, we must always step back from the glistening pinnacles of art and argument to survey that human topography in full. We must remember the scars and calluses, the fears and hungers, the lives worn raw by deprivation and diktat. Only then can we appreciate the true temper of a civilization, the cost as well as the glory. Our world today would scarcely be recognizable to Pericles or Plato. The material conditions, the scope of knowledge, the assumptions of society have all changed beyond measure. And yet, peering through the murk of centuries, we can still feel the tug of a shared human condition. The Greeks, too, knew love and loss, suffering and transcendence, the aching beauty and brevity of life. They, too, struggled to impose meaning on the vagaries of fate, and to light the spark of something enduring amidst the enveloping shade. As we sift the drifted strata of their distant lives, perhaps the most important lesson we can glean is one of perspective. To fully appreciate our own time, our own lives, in all their precious imperfection. To recognize all that we take for granted, and all that connects us to those who came before. The ancient Greeks crafted a legacy that echoes down the ages in philosophy, in statecraft, in art and architecture, in the very sinews of Western identity. But they equally remind us of the eternal fragility of the human enterprise, the finely blown boundaries of order and of life itself. In contemplating their world, so alien and yet so oddly proximate, we come face to face with the bigger questions of what it means to live, to strive, to leave some lasting mark on an indifferent cosmos, and in the end perhaps to make our own wary peace with a universe we cannot control, but only ride upon, like sailors on a storm-tossed sea, for one brief and shining moment. The ancient Greek world was also one of near constant warfare and conflict. Battle was a way of life for the Greek city-states, with gruesome methods like the phalanx formation and siege warfare commonplace. In the phalanx, rows of heavily armed hoplite soldiers would lock their shields together, forming a nearly impenetrable wall of wood, bronze, and flesh. They would advance on the enemy line, thrusting their spears forward in unison, aiming to break through with brute force. It was a horrifying sight and sound, thousands of men yelling their war cries, the clash of shields and armor, the screams of the dying. Siege warfare was equally brutal. When one city-state sought to conquer another, they would surround the city walls and cut off all supplies, seeking to starve the population into submission. This could drag on for months, or even years. The people inside the city walls would slowly waste away, succumbing to disease and malnutrition, with the stench of death and decay permeating the air. Outside the walls, the besieging army would pelt the city with boulders, arrows, and even catapulted balls of flaming pitch to spread fires inside. Sometimes, they would attempt to undermine the walls by digging tunnels underneath. If the city fell, the invading army would pour through the breached walls and run riot, burning, looting, and enslaving the survivors. It was a grim fate. Even the mightiest city-states like Athens and Sparta were not immune to the devastation of war. During the 27-year-long Peloponnesian War, tens of thousands were killed on both sides. One particularly disastrous episode centered around the brash Athenian noble Alcibiades, a ward of the famous Pericles. Alcibiades convinced the Athenians to launch an all-out expedition against the powerful city of Syracuse in Sicily. He claimed that once Syracuse fell, all of Sicily would come under Athenian control, providing a base to eventually conquer Carthage and dominate the Western Mediterranean. It was an audacious plan, but would prove to be a calamitous miscalculation. The Athenians assembled a massive force of some 30,000 men and over 100 warships, stripping the city of vital manpower, funds, and resources. Alcibiades was to be one of 3 commanders leading the armada, but on the eve of departure, a shocking controversy erupted. Sacred statues of Hermes throughout Athens were found to have been mutilated overnight, and rumours swirled that Alcibiades was responsible, having committed the sacrilege during a drunken romp. Facing outrage and legal charges, Alcibiades fled to Athens' mortal enemy Sparta before the fleet even set sail. Deprived of their most charismatic leader, the Athenian force carried on to Sicily under Nicias, a capable but cautious and pessimistic general. After initial victories, the Athenians became bogged down in a protracted siege of Syracuse. Sparta, at Alcibiades' urging, sent reinforcements and a ruthless commander named Gylippus to aid the Syracusans. The Athenians, riddled by disease and hunger, were eventually surrounded and decisively defeated. Their fleet was destroyed and their army almost entirely killed or captured. Athens ended up losing as much as 2/3 of its adult male population. It was a near-fatal blow from which the city never fully recovered. The Sicilian disaster highlighted the staggering human cost of ancient Greek warfare. Thousands would die far from home, often from sickness, as much as from battle itself. Many thousands more would be sold into slavery if captured. Even the survivors often returned with crippling wounds and psychological trauma. At the same time, the economic toll was immense. Waging war consumed staggering sums of money and resources, while trade, agriculture, and public works languished. This deepened the poverty and hardship of daily life for the masses. War was not just the scourge of free Greek citizens, though. It was also the grim conduit by which many foreigners and the unlucky were forced into perhaps the cruelest fate of all in the Greek world: a life of brutal slavery. Slavery was appallingly widespread in ancient Greece, forming the dark underbelly of Greek society and economy. By some estimates, there were 7 slaves for each free citizen in Athens, meaning that a large part of the population lived in bondage. The abhorrent conditions and exploitation these poor souls faced is difficult for the modern mind to fathom. Slaves were viewed as living property, with no rights or legal protections whatsoever. Many were captives from foreign wars, ripped from their homelands and families, transported in chains to the major slave markets in Athens, Chios, and Delos. There, they would be put on display, poked and prodded by prospective buyers, and auctioned off to the highest bidder. Prices ranged from 50 to 200 drachma for common laborers or domestic servants, to over 1,000 drachma for the most highly skilled craftsmen. Once purchased, the suffering really began. Slaves toiled from dawn to dusk under the whip and watchful eye of slave drivers. Thousands labored on the wealthy estates of the aristocracy, tending olive groves and vineyards. Many more worked as household servants, cooks, cleaners, and wet nurses. They could be subjected to beatings, brandings, sexual exploitation, and even summary execution at the whim of their masters. It was a precarious and often short existence. Perhaps the grimmest fate was reserved for those who toiled deep underground in the silver mines of Laurium. Within these Stygian labyrinths, thousands of wretched souls clawed the precious silver ore from the earth, powering Athens' wealth and prestige. Men, women, and children, as young as 5, would descend into the stifling shafts for days at a time, chipping at the rock by flickering lantern light. Accidents, rockfalls, and noxious gases claimed countless lives. Most would slowly waste away from malnutrition, chronic illness, and the grueling toil. Many committed suicide rather than face such prolonged agony. Laurium was like a vision of hell made real. One remarkable man who endured this subterranean nightmare was Zeno of Citium, the future founder of the Stoic school of philosophy. Zeno began his improbable life as a Phoenician merchant, but his ship sank in a storm off the coast of Greece, and he washed up on shore with nothing. There, he was captured, transported to Athens, and sold as a slave to work in the Laurium mines. Despite the soul-crushing hardship, Zeno retained his resilient and inquisitive spirit. After a grueling day in the mines, he would linger in the streets of Athens to hear the great philosophers debate and teach. He saved what meager pennies he could until he finally bought his freedom. Destitute but unbroken, Zeno devoted himself to philosophy. He often taught at the Agora and the Stoa Poikile, where he attracted a devoted following with his teachings on accepting fate, mastering one's emotions, and cultivating self-reliance. His Stoic school would become one of the most influential in all of Greece and Rome, shaping minds like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Zeno's remarkable story underscores that while ancient Greece was undoubtedly a cruel and unforgiving world for the vast majority, extraordinary individuals could still rise above their brutal circumstances. But his trajectory from foreign merchant to wretched slave to transformational philosopher was exceedingly rare. The reality is that the weak, the poor, and the unlucky masses faced subjugation, enslavement, or early death. Daily life was a harsh struggle for survival, and freedom was a precious commodity enjoyed only by a privileged minority. This was the bleak reality behind the glorious facade of Greek art and architecture, behind the soaring works of Homer and the great Athenian tragedies that still resound through the ages. It was a world of extremes, of oligarchs and slaves, of brilliant thinkers and wretched laborers, of magnificent cities built on the scarred backs of the many, a world of short, often violent lives, of plague and famine, of subjugation and constant warfare. The fact that the ancient Greeks achieved so much in art, philosophy, literature, and science in the face of such unrelenting adversity makes their accomplishments all the more remarkable. And so, as we drift off to sleep, lulled by these ancient tales, perhaps we can reflect that we are the fortunate ones, we descendants of the modern age, that for all our struggles and cares, we can give thanks that our daily lot is not one of antiquity, toiling beneath the Aegean sun, forever at the mercy of fickle gods and cruel men. The brutal world of ancient Greece lives on in our collective memory, revealed by the enduring works and deeds that still speak to us across the vast gulf of time. Those long-stilled voices and long-vanished lives grant us perspective, that we may more wisely navigate the challenges of our present day. And with that bittersweet thought, good night. The grim fate of Greek slaves. Slavery was an inescapable reality in ancient Greek society, a ubiquitous practice that fueled the economy and supported the elite way of life. From Athens to Sparta, slaves toiled in households, on farms, and in workshops, their labor exploited for the benefit of their masters. It's estimated that in some city-states, slaves made up as much as 1/3 of the total population. These enslaved individuals faced wretched living conditions, grueling labor, and the constant threat of violence and abuse. Many slaves were captives of war, ripped from their homes and families as spoils of Greek military conquests. Others fell into slavery through piracy, kidnapping, or by being born to slave parents. Once enslaved, they became the property of their masters, to be bought, sold, and treated as mere commodities. Slaves had no legal rights or protections, and their lives were entirely at the mercy of their owners. The experience of slaves varied somewhat, depending on their specific role and the temperament of their masters. Domestic slaves in wealthy households might have a marginally better quality of life, serving as cooks, cleaners, childcare providers, or even tutors for the family's children. But even these privileged slaves were subject to the whims and abuses of their masters. Female slaves in particular often faced sexual exploitation and assault. For the majority of slaves, daily life was filled with back-breaking labor and squalid conditions. Countless slaves worked from sunrise to sunset in the fields, planting and harvesting crops, tending to livestock, and performing any number of arduous agricultural tasks. With poor diets consisting of meager rations, inadequate clothing and shelter, and virtually no access to medical care, many rural slaves succumbed to malnourishment, exposure, and disease. One of the most notoriously brutal fates for a slave in ancient Greece was being sent to the silver mines, like the infamous mines of Laurium located near Athens. Deep underground, thousands of slaves toiled in hellish conditions, chiseling out the precious ore that helped finance the Athenian Empire. With air thick with dust, narrow tunnels prone to collapse, and only dim oil lamps to light the way, the mines were a living nightmare. Slaves worked in chains, facing regular beatings from their overseers to keep up the grueling pace. Many would not survive more than a few years in the mines before perishing from injuries, respiratory illnesses, or sheer exhaustion. The story of one ill-fated slave stands out as a chilling example. In 413 BCE, a young man named Dorius was captured after the Athenian siege of Syracuse and sold into slavery. A strong, able-bodied man, Dorius was immediately sent to the Laurium mines by his new master. Day after day, he chipped away at the rock face, his hands blistering and bleeding, his lungs filled with toxic dust. The meager scraps of food were never enough to sustain him through the long, unforgiving hours in the dark tunnels. Dorius's only solace was the bond he formed with his fellow slaves, men who struggled alongside him in shared misery. Together, they would whisper prayers and tell stories of their former lives, trying to hold on to some shred of hope and humanity. But as the months dragged on, Dorius watched his compatriots collapse one by one, their bodies giving out under the relentless toll of the mines. After 2 years of brutal servitude, Dorius too finally succumbed. Weakened by malnourishment and racked with an unrelenting cough, he collapsed in a heap and breathed his last in the cold dampness of the mine shaft. His body was unceremoniously hauled away to be dumped in an unmarked grave, just one more disposable cog in the machine of Greek industry and power. Dorius' experience, while especially horrific, was not uncommon. Slaves in ancient Greece faced a grim and often short existence, with few prospects beyond a life of hardship and an ignominious death. Even those who survived to old age could not expect a gentle twilight. Elderly or infirm slaves who could no longer work were often simply abandoned to die of exposure or starvation. Yet despite the unimaginable suffering they endured, the enslaved people of ancient Greece were not simply passive victims. There are scattered accounts of slave rebellions and uprisings, desperate attempts to resist their oppression and win their freedom against all odds. In most cases, these rebellions were ruthlessly put down, the participants executed as a warning to others, but they stand as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to accept the grim fate handed to them. Perhaps the most famous example of a slave who rose above his station was the philosopher Zeno of Citium. Born in the late 4th century BCE in the city of Citium on Cyprus, Zeno was the son of a merchant family, but around the age of 30, his life took a dramatic turn when he was shipwrecked while on a trading voyage and lost everything. Washing up in Athens, Zeno was soon enslaved, purchased by a wealthy Athenian to serve as a lowly household attendant. But Zeno's inquiring mind and keen intellect did not go unnoticed by his master. According to legend, the Athenian was so impressed by Zeno's wit and wisdom that he eventually freed him from bondage to pursue philosophy full-time. Embracing the austere teachings of the Cynics, Zeno went on to found the Stoic school of thought, preaching a message of virtuous living, self-discipline, and inner fortitude in the face of hardship. In a profound twist of fate, a man who began his life as a slave left an enduring philosophical legacy that has inspired minds for over 2 millennia. Yet for every exceptional story like Zeno's, countless more slaves lived and died anonymously under the yoke of Greek brutality. Their suffering and subjugation, though often overlooked, were a dark and inextricable undercurrent to the glories and achievements of ancient Greek civilization. It is a somber reminder that even the most advanced societies can be built on foundations of terrible injustice and cruelty. As we come to the end of our journey through the harsh realities of life in ancient Greece, it's worth reflecting on what lessons we can draw from this distant yet strangely familiar world. The ancient Greeks, for all their lofty ideals and intellectual triumphs, were still a product of their time and place, shaped by the brutality and callousness that characterized much of human history. Yet it would be a mistake to dismiss their struggles and successes as merely the product of a benighted past. In many ways, the challenges they faced, the spectre of war, the ravages of disease, the oppression of the weak by the strong, are ones that still confront us to this day. How we choose to meet those challenges, both as individuals and as societies, will determine what kind of world we shape for ourselves and for generations to come. Perhaps, in the end, the true value of studying history is not just to catalogue the events of the past, but to gain a deeper understanding of the human condition in all its frailty, cruelty, and indomitable resilience. By grappling with the grim realities that our ancestors endured, we may find the wisdom and resolve to bend the arc of our own story towards a brighter, more compassionate future. One where the dignity and worth of every person is celebrated, and the horrors of slavery and oppression are consigned to the dustbin of history. It is a noble aspiration, and one that we must never stop striving for, even against the longest odds. For as the Stoic philosopher Seneca once wrote, "As is a tale, so is life. Not how long it is, but how good it is what matters." May we all live our tales with courage, conviction, and unwavering commitment to building a world of justice and decency for all. And so, as we drift off to slumber, let us hold in our hearts the memory of all those who came before us, the farmers and soldiers, the artisans and philosophers, the masters and the enslaved. Their struggles and their triumphs, their joys and their sorrows, echo through the ages to remind us of our shared humanity and our shared responsibility to one another. In the quiet of the night, as the ancient world fades into the mists of dream, may we find the strength to face our own challenges with grace and resolve. And may the hard-won wisdom of the past light our way towards a future of greater compassion, justice, and peace for all. Good night. The grim fate of slaves in ancient Greece is a stark reminder of the cruelty and inhumanity that pervaded this celebrated society. For every gleaming marble temple or renowned philosopher, there were thousands of wretched souls toiling in bondage, their suffering and sacrifices lost to history. The Greeks saw slavery as a natural and necessary part of the social order. Aristotle himself declared that some men were slaves by nature, destined to serve their superiors. This belief allowed even the most enlightened thinkers to justify the ownership and exploitation of their fellow human beings. And exploited they were, for slaves were nothing more than living tools to the Greeks, disposable property to be used as their masters saw fit. Slaves worked from sunup to sundown, performing back-breaking labor in the fields, mines, workshops and homes with no reprieve. They were frequently beaten, starved and subjected to all manner of abuse and indignity. Many slaves met a particularly grisly end in the silver mines of Laurium, near Athens. There, thousands of unfortunate captives were sent to live out their days in dark, suffocating tunnels, hacking away at the rock in search of precious ore. The air was thick with poisonous dust, and cave-ins were a constant danger. Slaves who survived these hellish conditions rarely lasted more than a few years before perishing from injury, disease, or sheer exhaustion. A similarly bleak fate awaited the crews who rowed and fought aboard the warships of Athens. In order to maintain its vast naval supremacy, the city relied on a great number of slave oarsmen to propel its mighty triremes into battle. These men were chained to their benches and whipped mercilessly by overseers to keep time, even as missiles rained down from enemy ships. In the heat of combat, many would drown shackled to their oars, dragged to a watery grave by the very vessels they powered. Despite the unimaginable hardship of their lives, some slaves managed to rise above their circumstances through luck or sheer force of will. One such remarkable figure was Zeno of Citium, the founder of the Stoic school of philosophy. Born in the Phoenician city of Citium around 334 BC, Zeno found himself on a ship to Athens as a young merchant. But fortune took a tragic turn when he was shipwrecked and sold into slavery. As the property of a wealthy Athenian, Zeno labored for years before finally gaining his freedom. Undaunted by adversity, Zeno went on to study under the great philosopher Crates of Thebes. In time, he began teaching his own brand of philosophy which emphasized virtue, reason and inner strength as the keys to living well. At the heart of Stoicism was the idea that external circumstances, no matter how grim, need not determine one's peace of mind and moral character. It is a profound irony that Zeno, once a lowly slave, would create a school of thought so influential that it shaped great minds from Emperor Marcus Aurelius to Nelson Mandela. His personal triumph over bondage and suffering serves as a poignant counterpoint to the innumerable unnamed slaves whose tragic fates were the rule, not the exception, in ancient Greece. As we delve further into this brutal chapter of history, it is impossible not to be moved by the scale of human anguish that built the foundations of Western civilization. The great monuments and institutions we marvel at today were erected on the scarred backs of people deemed less than human by their own society. It is a devastating legacy we are still grappling with centuries later. Yet even in the darkest corners of the Greek world, the resilient human spirit endured. Slaves like Zeno remind us that no amount of cruelty and oppression can extinguish our capacity for hope, wisdom, and dignity in the face of unimaginable odds. Theirs are the untold stories that whisper from the shadows of history, bearing witness to the unbreakable will to survive and overcome. As we contemplate these somber truths, it is easy to feel the weight of all that was lost and destroyed on the long road to the present. But we must also recognize how far we've come, and how much further still we have to go in building a world of justice and compassion for all. The voices of the enslaved and downtrodden of ancient Greece call out to us across the ages, urging us to honor their struggles by shaping a future where no human being is ever again treated as lesser than any other. It is a daunting task, but one we must undertake with the same courage and determination displayed by those who endured the unendurable long ago. In this way, we can begin to forge a new legacy, one that celebrates not only the loftiest achievements of the past, but also the quiet heroism of the humble souls who persisted and perished in the shadows of history. Only then can we truly do justice to the memory of all those for whom life in ancient Greece was a brutal and unforgiving trial. The subjugation of women is another dark chapter in the annals of Greek civilization that belies its veneer of enlightenment and progress. For all the soaring rhetoric about democracy, reason, and human excellence, the Greeks saw fit to keep half of their population in a state of subordination and servitude, based solely on their sex. From birth to death, women in ancient Greece navigated a treacherous landscape of restrictions, obligations, and vulnerabilities. Their lives were circumscribed by the whims of men, fathers, husbands, brothers, and sons who held absolute power over their fates. Athenian society, in particular, was notorious for its strict control over women's bodies and movements. Respectable women were expected to stay cloistered within the home, tending to children and domestic tasks, rarely venturing outside except for special occasions like religious festivals. This seclusion was enforced through architecture itself, with houses designed around a central courtyard that served as the women's domain. High walls and sturdy doors separated this inner sanctum from the public sphere, creating a physical barrier between the sexes. On the rare occasions when women did leave the house, they were still bound by a suffocating web of social conventions. They could not go out alone or converse with unrelated men. When in public, they were required to veil themselves and cast their eyes downward to avoid attracting attention or provoking male lust. Even within the supposed safety of the home, women enjoyed precious little autonomy or agency. Marriages were arranged by fathers and guardians, with no input from the bride herself. Once wed, a woman came under the complete control of her husband, who had the power to divorce her on a whim, or even lend her to other men for procreation. Perhaps the cruelest twist of fate for Greek women was that their primary value lay in their ability to produce male heirs for their husbands' households. Failure to bear healthy sons was grounds for divorce or worse. This merciless calculus placed enormous pressure on women to fulfill their reproductive duties, even at great personal risk. Childbirth in the ancient world was a harrowing ordeal, with no anesthesia, antiseptics, or understanding of basic hygiene. Complications like hemorrhage and infection claimed countless mothers' lives. Those who survived the dangers of delivery faced the daunting task of raising children in a world stacked against them. With virtually no access to education or enrichment, women were consigned to an endless cycle of pregnancy, nursing, and domestic labor. Generations lived and died without ever glimpsing a world beyond the narrow confines of hearth and home. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming oppression, some remarkable women managed to carve out a measure of influence and independence. The legendary philosopher and mathematician Hypatia of Alexandria is one such shining example. Born around 350 AD, Hypatia was the daughter of Theon, a noted scholar who bucked societal norms by providing her with a rigorous education. Under his tutelage, she blossomed into a brilliant thinker, mastering complex subjects like astronomy, mechanics, and Neoplatonist philosophy. As an adult, Hypatia became a renowned teacher in her own right, attracting students from far and wide to her lectures on mathematics and science. She was also a prolific author, penning commentaries on works by Euclid, Diophantus, and Ptolemy that influenced scholars for centuries to come. But Hypatia's greatest achievement may have been the way she lived, as a fiercely independent, unmarried woman in a man's world. She moved freely through public spaces, engaging in spirited debates with male intellectuals, and earning the admiration of powerful figures like the prefect Orestes. In a time when women were seen as little more than breeding stock, Hypatia dared to cultivate her mind and speak her truth. She embodied the highest ideals of Greek philosophy, the pursuit of knowledge, reason, and virtue for their own sake. Tragically, Hypatia's luminous life was cut short by the very forces of ignorance and intolerance she sought to overcome. In 415 AD, she was brutally murdered by a mob of Christian zealots who saw her as a threat to their worldview. Dragged from her chariot and stripped naked, Hypatia was flayed alive with sharp tiles and oyster shells. Her mutilated body was then burned to ashes, as if to erase all trace of her existence. It is a bitter irony that one of the brightest lights of the ancient world was extinguished by the same violent misogyny she transcended in life. Hypatia's story stands as a searing indictment of the cruelty and waste inherent in any system that denies half of humanity the right to reach its full potential. As we reflect on the enormity of what women in ancient Greece endured and achieved in the face of impossible odds, we cannot help but feel a sense of kinship and responsibility to their struggles. The brave few, like Hypatia, who dared to defy their society's suffocating constraints, light the path forward for all those still fighting for basic dignity and agency today. Their courage calls us to imagine a world where no one's dreams are circumscribed by their gender, where everyone has the freedom to learn, create, and self-actualize to the fullest extent of their abilities. This is the vision we must strive for, even as we grapple with the sobering lessons of the past. For the shadows of ancient Greece's misogyny still lengthen over the present in ways both overt and subtle. Women around the globe continue to face violence, discrimination, and diminished opportunities solely on account of their sex. The struggle for true equality and liberation is far from over. But in the indomitable spirits of women like Hypatia, we can find the resilience and resolve to keep pushing forward, to keep chipping away at the cages that hem us in until they crumble away entirely. In telling their stories, in reckoning with the full scope of their oppression and resistance, we begin the vital work of weaving women back into the tapestry of history from which they've so often been erased. We honor their sacrifices and draw strength from their example as we fight to forge a future worthy of their hopes and dreams. It is a daunting challenge, but one we must meet with the same fierce determination as the unsung heroines who came before us. Only then can we hope to build a world where every life is valued, every voice heard, and every soul free to write its own destiny in the fullness of time. As we turn our gaze to the savagery of Greek warfare, we confront yet another aspect of ancient civilization, drenched in blood and sorrow. For all their lofty ideals and artistic splendor, the Greeks were a society forged and fractured by near-constant conflict. Battle was a way of life, a grim necessity in the struggle for power and survival between rival city-states. At the heart of this brutal calculus was the hoplite, the heavily armored infantrymen who formed the backbone of Greek armies. Clad in bronze helmets, breastplates and greaves, hoplites advanced shoulder to shoulder in a tightly packed formation known as the phalanx, their overlapping shields creating an impenetrable wall of wood and metal. When two phalanxes collided on the battlefield, the result was a ferocious clash of flesh and steel. Men stabbed and hacked at each other with spears and swords in a desperate bid to break through the enemy line. The air rang with the clang of metal on metal, the grunts of exertion, and the agonized screams of the dying. In this hellish crucible, there was no room for mercy or quarter. Hoplites fought not as individuals, but as a single organism bound by iron discipline and sheer force of will. To break ranks or flee was to invite disaster, dooming the entire formation to collapse and slaughter. The stakes of these confrontations could not have been higher, for defeat often meant the total destruction of a city-state. Victorious armies would raze villages to the ground, slaughtering or enslaving entire populations in a frenzy of bloodlust. The conquered survivors faced a grim choice between death and a life of abject servitude. One of the most notorious examples of this pitiless logic was the Athenian siege of the island city of Melos in 416 BC. The Melians, who had tried to remain neutral in the Peloponnesian War, were given a stark ultimatum by the Athenians: surrender and pay tribute or be annihilated. When the Melians refused, the Athenians unleashed a brutal assault, enslaving the women and children and massacring every man of military age. The once prosperous city was reduced to a smoking ruin, its people scattered to the winds or condemned to a life of bondage. The fate of Melos was a chilling demonstration of the savagery that lurked beneath the surface of Greek civilization. It laid bare the ruthless calculus of power that governed relations between city-states, where the strong devoured the weak and the only law was that of the sword. Yet even as we recoil at such barbarity, we must also confront the uncomfortable truth that it was this very savagery that fueled so many of ancient Greece's most enduring accomplishments. The wealth and glory of Athens in particular was built on a foundation of conquest, slavery, and slaughter. Nowhere was this dark symbiosis more apparent than in the famous Athenian campaign against Syracuse in 415 BC. At the height of its power, Athens launched a massive invasion of the Sicilian city, seeking to expand its empire and crush a potential rival. Leading the expedition was the dashing and charismatic Alcibiades, a brilliant general and orator who embodied both the best and worst of Athenian society. Handsome, wealthy, and ambitious, Alcibiades was a master manipulator who alternately charmed and bullied his way to the top of the political hierarchy. But for all his gifts, Alcibiades was also a man consumed by hubris and haunted by scandal. On the very eve of the Sicilian campaign, he was accused of drunkenly desecrating sacred statues throughout Athens. Faced with a trial and possible execution, Alcibiades fled to Athens' mortal enemy Sparta, where he promptly began plotting his former city's downfall. Without its most talented commander, the Athenian invasion of Syracuse soon descended into disaster. The Athenians found themselves trapped and besieged in a foreign land, their supply lines cut, and their morale shattered. In a desperate bid to break out, they launched a massive naval assault on the Syracusan harbour. What followed was one of the bloodiest and most tragic battles of the ancient world. Hundreds of triremes rammed and grappled with each other in the narrow confines of the harbour, while hoplites fought hand-to-hand on the decks above. The water ran red with blood, and the air was thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. When the carnage was over, the once invincible Athenian navy lay in ruins. Tens of thousands of Athenian soldiers and sailors were captured, tortured, and worked to death in Syracusan's stone quarries. The shattered remnants of the expedition limped back to Athens, their dreams of empire dashed and their city's fate sealed. The Sicilian disaster marked the beginning of the end for Athens and the golden age it represented. Never again would the city recapture its former glory or wield such power over the Greek world. In the end, its reach had exceeded its grasp, and its brilliant light had been snuffed out by the very darkness it sought to conquer. As we contemplate the grim fate of the Athenian expedition and the savage realities of Greek warfare, we are reminded once again of the terrible cost of hubris and the folly of unchecked ambition. The Athenians, like so many conquerors before and since, thought themselves invincible, only to be humbled by the pitiless logic of war. Their story is a cautionary tale for all those who would seek to dominate others through force and terror. It reminds us that no civilization, no matter how advanced or enlightened, is immune to the seductive pull of power and the madness of crowds. And yet, even in the midst of such darkness, we can still find glimmers of humanity and resilience. The Athenian soldiers who fought and died on the shores of Sicily were not faceless cogs in a machine, but living, breathing individuals with hopes and dreams of their own. In their final moments, they showed the same courage and loyalty that had made Athens great, even as their leaders led them to ruin. Their sacrifice, however futile, speaks to the enduring power of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. As we grapple with the legacy of Greek warfare and the uncomfortable truths it reveals about the human condition, we must also hold fast to this spirit of resilience and self-reflection. We must be willing to confront the darkness within ourselves and our societies even. The incredible mind of Aristotle seems to have known no bounds. Born in 384 BCE in Stagira, a small town on the northern coast of Greece, Aristotle's intellect and curiosity would carry him far beyond the confines of his humble birthplace. As the son of the personal physician to King Amyntas of Macedon, Aristotle's early life granted him a fortunate head start. At the age of 17, he journeyed to Athens to study at Plato's renowned academy. Here, among the olive groves and marble colonnades, Aristotle immersed himself in philosophy, mathematics, and the natural sciences. His agile mind quickly distinguished him as one of the academy's most brilliant pupils. For nearly 20 years, Aristotle remained at the academy, engaging in vigorous debates with his fellow students and even with Plato himself. While Aristotle deeply admired his teacher, he was not afraid to challenge Plato's ideas and develop his own groundbreaking theories. Aristotle's interests spanned an astonishing range of subjects, from biology and physics to ethics, politics, and metaphysics. He was a true polymath in every sense of the word. After Plato's death in 347 BCE, Aristotle embarked on his own philosophical journey. He traveled to the city of Assos, where he studied marine biology and married the adoptive daughter of the city's ruler. A few years later, Aristotle received an invitation that would change the course of history. His former pupil, Philip II of Macedon, asked Aristotle to return to Macedon to tutor his young son, a boy named Alexander. For several years, Aristotle mentored the bright and energetic prince, teaching him philosophy, politics, and the arts of rhetoric and debate. While we can only speculate about the details of their lessons, there is no doubt that Aristotle played a profound role in shaping the intellect and worldview of the young Alexander. The depth of their bond is reflected in a famous quote attributed to Alexander: "I am indebted to my father for living, but to my teacher for living well." As Alexander grew into a formidable leader and set out to conquer the known world, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school called the Lyceum. Here, he wrote extensively on a vast array of subjects and delivered lectures to eager students. Aristotle's methods were a departure from those of Plato's academy. Rather than focusing on abstract ideas alone, Aristotle emphasized empirical observation and logical reasoning. He collected samples, conducted experiments, and meticulously categorized his findings. Aristotle's surviving works are a testament to his far-ranging genius. In his treatises on natural sciences, he laid the foundation for the modern scientific method. His studies of plants and animals were unrivaled for centuries. In philosophy, Aristotle grappled with fundamental questions of existence, knowledge, and ethics. His concept of the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies in moderation between extremes, remains deeply influential to this day. Yet even Aristotle could not escape the turbulent politics of ancient Greece. After the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE, anti-Macedonian sentiment surged in Athens. Aristotle, perceived as being too close to the Macedonian court, found himself facing charges of impiety. Unwilling to let Athens sin twice against philosophy, a poignant reference to the execution of Socrates, Aristotle fled to the island of Euboea. There, in the ancient town of Chalcis, he lived out his final year. Aristotle's story is a reminder that even in a world as harsh and unforgiving as ancient Greece, the light of knowledge and understanding could still flourish. Aristotle's ideas would endure long after his death, sparking lively debates among philosophers and scientists for more than 2,000 years. Today, we remember Aristotle as one of the most brilliant and influential thinkers in human history, a shining example of how one curious mind can illuminate the darkness and leave a legacy that echoes through the ages. As we conclude our journey through the brutal realities of ancient Greek life, it's worth reflecting on the incredible resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit. From the backbreaking labor of farmers to the blood-soaked battlefields of hoplite warfare, the ancient Greeks endured unimaginable hardships. Yet even amidst such suffering, they managed to create art, philosophy, and literature that still captivate us to this day. Perhaps there is something to be learned from their example, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we possess the strength to persevere and the capacity for greatness. As you drift off to sleep, let your mind wander through the olive groves and marble halls of ancient Greece, secure in the knowledge that you are part of a grand and enduring human story. And if you found this journey through history engaging, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are countless more tales to be told and wisdom to be gleaned from the annals of human civilization. Join us again for another journey through the past. You may just find that the struggles and triumphs of our ancestors have much to teach us about our own lives today. But for now, close your eyes, let your mind be at ease, and slip softly into the warm embrace of sleep.